Chapter 1935. If Zhang Yan was willing, he could easily change the desires of all living beings in the world with just a little bit of skill. And without the grand elders of the Quan clan and De clan, no one would be able to stop him. However, he could feel that if he wanted to obtain that item, he shouldn't interfere too much with the Heaven Court's conflict. This was also the reason why Grand Elders never interfered in the fight for the throne. Therefore, he only passed down the task and ordered his disciples to do as they pleased. Now, he was the only one in the universe who could be called Grand Elder. He could observe the past and the future. Not to mention that he wouldn't fail this time, even if there was an accident, he could try again. After Dongguang received the order, he immediately went to the Yanlu kingdom. The 11th prince listened to his advice and didn't make any moves, waiting for Hao Chang to ascend the throne. Until now, he didn't declare to attack Hao Chang like the other princes. He was just waiting for the right time to come. After Dongguang arrived, he had a detailed discussion with him. A few days later, the Yanlu kingdom also raised the flag of attack. After the new emperor Hao Chang heard about this, he was shocked and angry. He knew very well that the 11th prince was backed by the Forgottenly Mountain and that they were allies. Therefore, after becoming the Heaven Emperor, he wanted to rope in the 11th prince. If Hao Ning rebelled now, it meant that the Grand Elder behind the Forgottenly Mountain had acquiesced to this. If this Grand Elder was on Dao's side, it would be difficult for him to sit on the throne. Therefore, he quickly invited Daoist Run Ming to teach him about this. Although the Grand Elders of the two sects were banished, their disciples still existed in this world. However, the Grand Elders rarely appeared in front of people. Therefore, on the surface, there seemed to be no change in the heavens. The two sects were still unaware of this. Therefore, Daoist Run Ming did not understand the reason behind this. He only comforted Hao Chang, "Don't worry, Your Highness. Now that you are the Heaven Emperor, you have billions of demon soldiers and tens of thousands of chi practitioners. Even if there are no Star Lords, you are enough to suppress the worlds. Even if the princes join forces to attack you, you have nothing to fear." As for this matter, a few days ago, Patriarch and the Forgottenly Mountain's Grand Elder visited Zeke Mountain. Maybe something happened, let me ask Patriarch. Daoist Run Ming immediately went back to burn incense and pay his respects, but there was no response. He could only inform Hao Chang and have him wait. In Yanlu Kingdom, with the help of the cultivators of Li Wang Mountain, the 11th prince recruited many chi practitioners and rogue immortals. In a short period of time, his power increased exponentially. After a little preparation, he imitated what Hao Chang had done earlier and raised his army to attack the Heaven Court. The 11th prince never used demons under his command, so he didn't have many troops. This time, there were barely 1,000,000 of them. However, there were indeed many cultivators in the formation, even more than the new Emperor Hao Chang, who had already ascended to the throne. Because most of the newly recruited soldiers of the Heavenly Court had gone to the lower realms to quell the rebellion, there was almost no obstruction along the way. In just a few days, they had already killed their way to the Yingyuan Hall. If this continued, it seemed that there would be a new emperor in the heavens. Hao Chang didn't expect the 11th prince's troops to advance so quickly. Seeing the urgency of the situation, he invited Priest Run Ming over and asked, "Priest, what should we do? You told me to wait the last time, but why haven't there been any results after so many days?" To ease his mind, Priest Run Ming could only say, "I have asked, the Patriarch is fighting with Dao and has no time to care about this. But don't worry, Your Highness, with my help, the Heaven Court won't be in danger." Hao Chang said, "It's a pity that the Celestial Lords of Heaven don't work for me. Otherwise, why would this happen?" Priest Run Ming frowned. The Celestial Lords of Heaven were indeed a big problem. Not long ago, he had figured out the reason why this generation was still unwilling to follow the new emperor's orders. It was because Ji Lu and the others had previously blocked Ying Kuang as a condition that they couldn't work for Hao Chang before the heavens were truly stabilized. In reality, it was just a promise and couldn't bind this generation. The real reason was that the Celestial Lords of Heaven saw that Quan Dao hadn't been able to establish a proper religion, so they didn't think highly of Hao Chang. Thus, they used this as an excuse to sit back and do nothing. After all, no matter which prince became the new emperor, he wouldn't be able to leave them in the end. When Hao Chang saw that the 11th prince had already reached the gates of the heaven court, he could no longer care about anything else. He called back all the soldiers that were sent to deal with the princes. Initially, he wanted to rely on his superior numbers to defeat the princes in one fell swoop. However, as soon as the two sides clashed, the 11th prince's side had more chi practitioners than the heaven court by a few times. Their skills and techniques rained down like rain, causing the 11th prince to suffer a great defeat. After Hao Chang received the report, he understood that there was no hope of fighting the 11th prince head-on. Thus, he could only rely on the array formations in the Hall of Yuan to call back all the soldiers to defend. But these array formations didn't have much effect under the suppression of the true immortals of Mount Li Wang. They were attacked one after another, and the guards in the hall retreated day by day. It seemed like they wouldn't be able to hold on for long. Daoist Run Ming's heart was heavy. He tried to use his power to suppress the 11th prince, but he was blocked by the true immortals of Mount Li Wang. He knew that he wouldn't be able to hold on for long, so he prayed to the patriarch again. But he still didn't get any response. Thus, he could only send out a letter to summon all his peers from Quan Dao. He didn't even care about the arrangements that he had prepared to defend against the Tao of Virtue. As for the Tao of Virtue, they didn't know that their patriarch had been expelled, so they thought that it was a fight between Quan Dao and Mount Li Wang. They were happy to watch from the sidelines, waiting for both sides to suffer. Then, they would order the princes that they supported to go up and take down both sides. When Dandy Guang saw that the true immortals of Quan Dao had all arrived, the situation was at a stalemate. In order to break through the heaven courtyard as soon as possible, he handed the matter over to his peers and went down to the lower bound to look for Yin Kuang. Yin Kuang saw him and asked, "Is Daoist here to collect my heavenly talisman?" Dandy Guang smiled and shook his head. "The heavenly talisman was refined by the Tao of Virtue's Taishang, so I won't take it from Mount Li Wang. After the 11th prince ascends to the throne, the patriarch will refine another one." Yin Kuang asked, "Then why did Daoist come here?" Dandy Guang said, "The 11th prince led the army to attack the heaven courtyard. Now that the war is at a stalemate, we need imperial censors to take action." At this point, he added, "Mount Li Wang will allow you to pass on the heavenly talisman to your disciple. If you are interested, after the 11th prince ascends to the throne, we can also bestow him with a title." Yin Kuang didn't agree immediately, but asked, "After the 11th prince ascends to the throne, how will the celestial beings be dealt with?" Dandy Guang smiled and took out a letter from his sleeve. "This is personally written by the 11th prince, imperial censors can take a look at it." Yin Kuang took the letter and read it. After a while, he carefully kept the letter, stood up, and cupped his hands, saying, "Wait for me to explain." Then, he left with Daoist Zhang. Imperial censors At the same time, the 11th prince, Hao Neng, was entertaining a messenger sent by the Heavenly Mother. The messenger first handed over an imperial edict, then said, "The Hao clan has always been in charge of the heaven courtyard, and the Yun clan has always been in charge of human relations. If your highness is willing to agree to Heavenly Mother's conditions, Heavenly Mother can help your highness ascend to the throne." Hao Neng looked at it and raised his head, saying, "Heavenly Mother is my father's queen, so I can respect her as my mother. However, I need Heavenly Mother to promise me one thing." The messenger said, "Please speak, your highness." Hao Neng said, "Since the Hao clan is in charge of the heaven courtyard, the Yun clan will no longer receive any tributes after I ascend to the throne." The messenger was in a difficult position. Hao Neng said, "I know it's hard for the messenger to make the decision. You can pass my words to Heavenly Mother. If she agrees, then come here again. If she doesn't, then there's no need to meet again." The messenger didn't have much to say, so he said, "I will pass on your highness's words." After he cupped his hands, he left. However, half a day later, he turned back and said, "Heavenly Mother wishes to have a talk with your highness." After getting Hao Neng's permission, he took out a scroll and unfolded it. Heavenly Mother's appearance was reflected. When Haoning saw it, he bowed and said, "Greetings, Heavenly Mother." Heavenly Mother nodded slightly and said, "Your Highness, you may dispense with the formalities. Let me ask you, if I'm not willing to take in the Yun clan disciples, what will your Highness do?" Haoning said resolutely, "After I ascend to the throne, I will immediately order them to migrate. If they don't obey, there will be restrictions from the heavens." Heavenly Mother said, "Your Highness, aren't you afraid of attracting criticism from the heavens?" The so-called criticism from the heavens was similar to the situation that Hao Chang faced. Even if he ascended to the throne, there would be many who opposed it, causing the throne to be unstable. If it was before, Hao Chang wouldn't have dared to do this. Now that he knew that Didao and Quan Dao's Tai Shang had been expelled by the Li Wang Mountain's Tai Shang, why would he need to worry about this person? Thus, he said, "I walk on the righteous path, what do I have to fear?" Heavenly Mother looked at him for a moment and sighed, "Among all the princes, you are the most similar to His Majesty. As the Yun clan leader, I won't do anything that will harm my clansmen. Your Highness, do what you have to do." As soon as she finished, her figure slowly dissipated. On the second day, Haoning's side continued to attack. This time, with the help of Ing Kuang's heavenly talisman, Quan Dao's perfected immortals couldn't resist anymore. Seeing that the situation was hopeless, they didn't bother anymore and left in conveyance lights. Without Quan Dao's support, Hao Chang was forced to abdicate. 2 months later, the 11th prince ascended to the throne and immediately issued a decree to invite the Li Wang Mountain to be the righteous path. However, at this time, Didao used the same trick again and refused to retreat. However, this time was different from the previous time. As the Tai Shang had been expelled, the Weili naturally didn't exist. Therefore, the person who issued the summons immediately barged into the hall and forcibly removed the memorial tablets of the 3 Tai Shang, Didao and Quan Dao. He also removed the side hall. From then on, there were no 2 halls and only Zhang Yan was worshipped. At the moment when Li Wang Mountain was worshipped as the righteous path, Zhang Yan's heart moved. He could clearly sense that a mysterious object appeared in this world. It didn't come from the outside like the spiritual enhancement Weili, nor was it born when he created the world. It seemed to have always been there, but he just didn't notice it. He looked at the object for a moment and calculated in his heart for a long time. He realized that it was very consistent with one of his previous guesses. He couldn't help but nod and said, "I see." He reached out and flipped his wrist. In a split second, the object was already in his palm. Chapter 1936. Zhang Yan looked at the object in his palm. It was shapeless and formless. He knew it was there, but he couldn't see it. However, as he stared at it, it became brighter and brighter. In the end, it became a core that shined like a star. In reality, this wasn't the item's original appearance. He had given it a unique appearance. He could sense this item and didn't need to do so. The reason he did this was because he knew that this was something that the spirit refinement cultivators wanted. Once he completed his cultivation, he would have to fight with his peers. He used himself as an example. If he was looking for this item, then he would definitely try to obstruct him. At that time, his senses would be disturbed and he might not be able to find it smoothly. With this change in appearance, it would be relatively difficult for others to deceive him. As he continued to look, everything around him became illusory. Then, he found himself standing at a place where countless worlds intersected. He wasn't the only one here. There were several Taoists here. However, their faces were blurry and it was difficult to tell what they looked like. Seeing him arrive, one of the Taoists turned around and bowed, "You are here." Zhang Yan's expression was calm as he returned the bow. After the Taoist greeted him, he moved away. Zhang Yan looked over. These Taoists were all talking about something. The object they were talking about was a place that looked like a star. His brows couldn't help but raise when he saw this object because it wasn't difficult to discern that this object was closely related to the treasured core in his hand. However, it still seemed to be extremely perfect at this moment, and it was very likely that it was the source of the treasured core. Now, Other than feeling this item, he didn't know what it was used for. However, from the scene in front of him, it was enough to tell that it wasn't simple. At this time, one of the Taoists said, "Since you think it's possible, then let's do it." The other Taoists discussed for a while and nodded their heads. The Taoist who greeted Zhang Yan earlier turned around and said to him, "What do you think, fellow Taoist?" Zhang Yan's eyes flickered but he didn't say anything. Seeing that he didn't answer, the Taoist didn't continue asking. Instead, he walked closer and closer to the object. Zhang Yan stared at it. He could feel that something big was about to happen. At this moment, as if in a trance, everything became unclear. Amidst the haziness, the Taoist seemed to have used some sort of technique on that object. In the next moment, the dazzling light suddenly shattered and turned into countless stars, disappearing into the world. The Taoists seemed to be affected and disappeared one by one. It was as if a great calamity had suddenly erupted. Zhang Yan watched this scene quietly. He understood in his heart that no matter what these Taoists wanted to do, it was obvious that they were not able to succeed in the end. Instead, they had caused such an unexpected outcome. When he saw that this place had completely vanished and he couldn't see anything else, he intended to leave. However, at this moment, he noticed that even though most of the people had vanished, there was still a Taoist who remained. It wasn't the Taoist who greeted him earlier, but someone else. He changed his mind. This Taoist just now was standing extremely far away, as if he was deliberately keeping a distance from that object. Seeing him look over, the Taoist said meaningfully, "Fellow Taoist, you and I have finally met." Although Zhang Yan hadn't met him before, when he spoke, he immediately understood the other party's identity through the trace of karma. From the interaction between the two of them, he could barely be considered an old acquaintance. Zhang Yan nodded and said, "So it's fellow Taoist Zhou. I didn't expect to see you here." The Taoist raised his eyes and looked at the countless worlds. He sighed and said, "This chaos is my generation's loss. However, there are losses and gains. I must seek the fruit of Tao bestowed by the heavens. If you can give me the object in your hand, I can let go of all the karma in the past. What do you think?" Zhang Yan smiled faintly and said with his sleeves behind his back, "If you want that object, you can come and get it. I will be waiting for you." The Taoist looked at him deeply and didn't say anything more. He turned around and left. Then, like the Taoists before him, he gradually disappeared. Zhang Yan moved his mind and the scene around him suddenly shattered. He returned to where he was before. The object in his hand was still there. Just now, everything he experienced could be said to have happened in the past. However, not only that, after he became a spirit refinement cultivator, everything he experienced must be real. In other words, if these were the things that happened in the past, then as long as he saw them, he would exist in the past and he would no longer be a bystander. And the Taoists he saw would also feel him at that time. He moved his gaze down and looked at the object again. From the words and actions of the Taoists, it wasn't hard to deduce that this object might be related to a higher level of mystery. However, when he thought of the shattering scene, it was very likely that this was only a fragment. He thought about the battle between the Tao of virtue and the Tao of perfection. It seemed that these almighty beings must have fought for this object in countless modern worlds. Then, he had to pay attention to this. As for what exactly it was and why it caused the predestined scene, although he didn't know the cause and effect, he had some shallow guesses. Logically speaking, since he was a spirit refinement cultivator, then when he saw that scene, he should have known everything. The reason why he didn't know this, according to his deduction, was because he wasn't perfect yet. Or maybe someone was trying to cover it up. As his cultivation level gradually increased, he would be able to find more fragments of that item. Presumably, his understanding of the inside story would also gradually become more detailed. Thinking about this, he put the object away. No matter how mysterious this object was, he couldn't use it yet. However, the threat of the Taoist was right in front of him. Although his cultivation level wasn't perfect yet, he wasn't afraid of the Taoist coming to disturb him. This was because this modern world was created by him. When it was first created, he focused on the inside. Only the whaley outside had the chance to invade. When his mana filled the entire modern world, it was hard to shake it. Now that everything was ready, it was time for him to complete his cultivation level and take that step. He gathered his spiritual chi and spread out his mana. In an instant, he connected with his real body outside of the modern world. The real body that was sitting cross-legged in the void suddenly opened his eyes. Then, he saw that the modern world that he created merged with the countless existences and the ones that had already died. Tao begets one, one begets two, two begets three, three begets all things. The emptiness sees me, and I see the emptiness. When this was born, it became immeasurable. This time, he refined the whaley of his peers and broke free from a modern world. At this moment, he had achieved endless changes. Every spirit refinement cultivator's mana was endless. It looked like it was hard to tell who was stronger or weaker, but in reality, it wasn't the case. There were strong and weak ones among them. Usually, there were two reasons for this. One was after stepping into this realm and competing with others of the same generation, it would show up, which was the mana he had obtained before. The other reason was because it depended on his original foundation, which was the birth of Tao. Just now, when he created the modern world river, his mana was on par with the spirit refinement cultivators of the same generation. This was because his original past and the modern world were gone, as if they didn't exist. Therefore, this part was actually missing, which meant it wasn't complete. Now that his cultivation level was complete and he got everything back, the accumulation of the past would naturally be returned to him. Like a pile of firewood, it pushed his mana and cultivation level to continuously rise. Between the spirit refinement cultivators, the whaley clashed with each other. Some were strong, some were weak, some advanced, some retreated. He gradually sensed that as his Fa-Li increased, the mighty power that spread out gradually overshadowed those of the same generation that he could sense. It gradually pushed them out, and it was still continuing to suppress them. He raised his eyes and looked at the world, looking at the constant changes of all things. His mind turned and he chanted, able to refine the void and help the people, named Supreme Great Tao Venerable. Don't say that the sky has no beginning and end, the gods of the fortune gate will always exist. After standing still for a moment, he turned his consciousness back to the current world. Now, he knew that the gods and even the heavenly court were born from the item in his hand that fell into the modern world. As long as he traced it back, he would be able to find it. This was the reason why Virtue Dao and even Quan Dao guarded the heavenly court and made an agreement with it. However, when he looked out from Wangli Mountain, everything related to the heavenly court had disappeared, as if it had never existed. This was because he had already obtained the fragment. Since the root of the fragment had been lost, everything related to it naturally did not exist. In reality, it did not really turn into nothingness. The fragments between the items were also connected. When he found the place where the fragment was, he could still see the existence of this fragment. Deducing from this, the more fragments he had, the greater the advantage he had and the greater the chance of obtaining it. Thinking of this, he tried to search in other parts of the modern world, but he did not find any similar fragments. It was obvious that this item was not easy to find. Thus, he stopped and started to trace the expanding mana, trying to find his peers. But not long after, he discovered that these peers existed in a distant place, seemingly alive but not dead, seemingly dead but not alive, and no one responded to him. He thought about it and guessed that this might be caused by the change he saw just now. There was only one person, although his mana had not collided with his, but he could sense that person more and more clearly, as if he was about to arrive. This person should be the one who was about to take the item in his hand. When the item shattered, it seemed that the impact on this person was relatively weak. Moreover, this person was connected to him by karma, so he could find him. He pondered for a while. Right now, he could reveal his original origin in the modern world at any time, but because this Taoist was about to arrive, he could only put it aside for now. After dealing with this person, he would deal with this matter later. Chapter 1937. Zhang Yan stood in the void, quietly waiting for the enemy to arrive. There was no past or future here, so there was no distance. Logically speaking, if the other party wanted to, he could arrive in an instant. However, the magic power of the spirit refinement almighty beings reflected each other, so there would be all kinds of restrictions. This was the restriction that the other party gave him, and also the restraint that he gave the other party. Thus, although the spirit refinement almighty beings had transcended the present world, when they collided, all kinds of shackles would come one after another. While waiting, he fell into deep thought. This ancestral master Zhou had come to find him, and his excuse was for the fragment in his hand. As for the karma of the past, he did not think it was a big deal. At least at the spirit refinement level, everything in the present world was just a clash of wills. There was no need to make a big fuss over it. However, was it worth fighting with someone of the same generation just for a fragment? From the perspective of integrity and morality, this person must have made an agreement with someone of the same generation. Now that he had come to find him, perhaps he thought that he was not part of the agreement, and because he had just become a spirit refinement cultivator, he could control him. He shook his head slightly, dismissing this thought. His true goal should be the present world behind him. Back then, where the 9 continents was, there were many large sections. There was no need to talk about the great underworld ancestral master, but this ancestral master Zhou was a spirit refinement cultivator. It could be imagined that the other ancestral masters of the other large sects also had such cultivation, or else they would not be on the same level. For the 9 continents to have so many almighty beings and even have sects, there must be something special about it. Combining what he had seen and what had happened in the past, he had a relatively accurate guess in his heart. His goal should be Bushutian. Bushutian should be a part of that thing after it broke apart, and it might be the most complete part that remained. This was not only because there were no similar existences in the present world, but also because the fragment in his hand had some kind of connection with it. The change in Bushutian back then might also be related to this. If it was really as he had guessed, then the present world with Bushutian was an extremely important place, and it might even involve a higher realm. It was no wonder that this ancestral master Zhou could not wait to find him. He sensed for a moment and found out that the person had yet to arrive. So, he calmed his mind and carefully comprehended the wondrous Tao in the state. After an unknown period of time, he felt an unprecedented intensity in the collision of mana. He knew that the other party had arrived, so he looked up and saw a Taoist pushing away the mana barrier and slowly walking out from the darkness. The Taoist bowed to him and said, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, greetings." Zhang Yan shook his sleeves and bowed in return, saying, "Fellow Taoist Zhou, I have been waiting for a long time." Priest Zhou didn't seem to have any intention of attacking immediately. Instead, he glanced at him and smiled. "I'm sure you already know why I'm here." Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, "I have a guess." Priest Zhou sighed and said, "Back then, all of you gathered together to obtain the fruit of Tao and thought that you would be able to see the supreme technique. However, you did not succeed and were harmed instead. Now, although you are not in eternal silence, you are not far from it." As he said this, his voice was filled with sincerity. He bowed to Zhang Yan again and said, "Fellow Taoist has transcended from the present world. As long as you are willing, you can return to this place. Now, as long as you open the door and allow us to comprehend it again, I will comprehend it together with fellow Taoist." Zhang Yanguang looked at his face and said, "Oh. So you are saying that fellow Taoist Zhou did not come here alone?" Priest Zhou said, "That is true. This time, I came here on behalf of the few of you. I hope that fellow Taoist can make things easier for me. Other than me, the few of you are also indebted to me." Zhang Yan's mind changed. From the previous contact, the other party landed in the formation of virtue and Tao. Then the other 2 spirit refinement cultivators should also exist. However, he thought that the truth might not be as what the other party said. Saying that he was asked by others was just to give him pressure. The real situation was that he might have come here alone without the others' knowledge. Or else, why would he say so much? With the 3 of them here, wouldn't it be easier to force him to open the door to the present world? Of course, this might not be able to suppress him, but it was obviously more likely to win than coming here alone. He would definitely not let them open the door. It was not because he saw this place as his own, but because the spirit refinement cultivators fought against each other. Although they called each other Taoist friends, they were actually opponents. If he let the other party enter, after his strength increased, he would seek more and perhaps turn around to deal with him. At that time, he might not even be able to keep the fragment in his hand. He replied plainly, "Fellow Taoists request, forgive me for not being able to agree." Seeing his determined expression, Taoist Zhou knew that he would not be swayed by words. He shook his head, "Since you insist, then I will have to take it myself." With a step, he turned into the void and disappeared. However, his mana was still there and started to surge like a rising tide, pressing towards him. Zhang Yan did not react passively, he also activated his mana and faced him head-on. This was just like the collision of the tides on both sides. Since both sides had boundless mana, it was a never-ending stream. Just now, while they were talking, the battle of mana had never stopped. It was just that they left some leeway back then, but now, they let go of the restraints. Zhang Yan looked towards where Taoist Zhou disappeared. In the battle of spirit refinement, the worst result would be being forced into eternal silence by the other party. However, he thought that other than the first step into spirit refinement, when one's mana was not yet complete, it would be very difficult to be expelled. Unless one had an absolute advantage in one aspect and used absolute mana to overwhelm the opponent, to the extent that the opponent did not even have the ability to open the door to the present world and continue to wear him down. Of course, there were some special methods involved. Therefore, he wanted to see what Taoist Zhou was going to do to him. After a few clashes, because his mana was stronger, he gradually gained the upper hand. However, at this moment, his opponent's mana suddenly changed. Not only did it stop his decline, but it also pushed him back. Zhang Yan's heart skipped a beat. His opponent's mana was not truly stronger than his, in fact, it was slightly weaker. To be able to do this, he must have used some special method. Because spirit refinement's mana interacted with each other during the battle, some things could not be hidden. At least, the most superficial things could not be covered up. Therefore, he only needed to stare for a moment to understand the reason behind it. His own FA power could be said to be incomparably pure, but this also meant that it lacked variation. His opponent's FA power was actually the same when they first crossed swords, but now, it had undergone some sort of fundamental change. It had actually risen to a whole new level. In this way, even if his opponent's FA power was originally on the weaker side, because of its superior quality, it appeared even more powerful. Of course, now that he knew all this, he could try to change it. It was not difficult, he could do it with just a thought. But his opponent would definitely change according to his changes. Then, they would fall into another level of battle. This kind of comparison was decided by the cultivation of both parties. The deeper the cultivation, the more exquisite the usage. Therefore, if two spirit refinement cultivators were to fight, if they only compared their mana, it would not be enough to decide who was stronger. They would have to look at their cultivation. Someone's mana was clearly stronger than his opponent, but he was forced to retreat. This seemed illogical, but judging from the difference in cultivation, it was the most normal thing. Therefore, the battle of spirit refinement was to see who was stronger and who was weaker. It was also to see how many restrictions each party could place on their opponent. If one were to rely on one's deep mana and blindly chase, at most the other party would be forced to retreat and nothing much could be done. However, through the profound cultivation and subtle techniques, one could even shake the foundation of one's peers. But there was another kind of situation. When one party's mana reached a certain level, then no matter how the other party changed, as long as the difference in cultivation was not too big, the other party would at most have a certain advantage and would not be able to defeat his opponent. Now, Zhou Daoren was in such a situation. Zhang Yan had just entered spirit refinement, his cultivation was obviously not as good as him. But his mana was strong and he could also change accordingly. Now, through the continuous battle, he gradually understood more mysteries. Therefore, after the initial passive situation, he gradually became stronger. When Zhou Daoren noticed this, he decisively stopped. Because he knew he could not use this to overwhelm Zhang Yan. If this continued, Zhang Yan would be able to gain more from the battle. In the end, perhaps he would be the one being suppressed. Even though he thought he still had other tricks up his sleeve, but there was no need to reveal them all. After all, he had already achieved part of his goal. He stretched out his hand and pointed. A golden lotus flower flew out and supported Zhang Yan's mana. Then, he walked out from the darkness, bowed and said, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist." As he spoke, there was a rumble and a new world unfolded. Then, the lotus flashed and disappeared. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. This time, the mana of both parties collided and blended. From it, he understood the wonders of Zhou Daoren's Tao techniques. It could be said that he had learned a lot. But Zhou Daoren also learned something from him, such as the karma connection with the original world. Zhou Daoren had entered spirit refinement for a long time. Even though he could not overwhelm him in terms of mana, he was more proficient in the use of other methods. In fact, he did not need to completely open the door to the original world. He only needed to borrow the karma and use Tao techniques to calculate it. Then, he could retreat from the beginning and create another world. Then, it was possible to use this world to find clues about Bushutian from another direction. This new world might have more than 70 to 80% of what he had experienced before. But because he had jumped out of this world, and even the past and the future, no one could find him in the past. So, he no longer existed in that world. It could be imagined that in the 9 continents, when the final battle between Yuxiao and Qinsung factions occurred, he would no longer exist. Instead, Yuxiao school might receive strong reinforcements. In the end, it was very likely that Yuxiao would win. This would cause all the results in the future to be different. But this was not the most important thing. Under Zhou Daoren's deliberate push, Yuxiao school might change its original way of doing things, and then catch a glimpse of Bushutian and merge with it. Zhang Yan thought about it for a moment. He couldn't change what he had experienced in the past. This world was nothing more than something that Taoist Zhou had created. If no one tried to stop him, he wouldn't necessarily succeed the first time, but he would definitely try again and again, gradually getting closer and closer until he found that place. Therefore, no matter what, he had to stop him. Chapter 1938. Zhou Daoren could feel the world slowly unfolding and could not help but shake his head slightly, clearly dissatisfied with it. If it was not for Zhang Yan's obstruction, then he could create thousands of worlds in an instant. If everything went smoothly, then he would be able to find Bushutian in an instant. However, due to the intense clash between the two of them, even with the help of the Bao Lotus, he couldn't do as he pleased. He could only forcefully create this Tao of emergence, but he couldn't see the results for a long time. This added a lot of variables. It would be best if he could avoid his opponent to do this. Unfortunately, his cultivation had yet to reach such a level. In the current situation, because the two of them already knew each other, even if one of them retreated, as long as something related to the other was involved, the other would immediately sense it. Therefore, there was no obvious difference between doing it in front of the other and doing it behind their backs. Fortunately, with his profound cultivation, he could be considered to have taken the initiative. As long as he maintained the situation and tried to delay for a long time, then he would eventually be able to find Bushutian. At this moment, Zhang Yan also saw his opponent's difficulty. Although Zhou Daoren had hidden that world, it had not completely evolved yet. He still had enough time to find it, but he was not in a hurry to do this. Instead, he took the opportunity to observe and increase the level of his Fa Li once again. In the previous competition of cultivation, because Taoist Zhou had changed first and was already familiar with this Tao, even though he had caught up, he was still one step behind. One step behind meant that he would fall behind step by step. Now he could only barely maintain his position, but in the end he was being pressured by the other. It was also because of this that Zhou Daoren had the opportunity to withdraw and open up the world. But after this action, it was clear that he could not take care of the situation at the same time. So, Zhou Daoren immediately seized this opportunity and reversed the original disadvantage. However, if he wanted to take another step forward and crush his opponent's mana, it would be a little difficult. This was because his opponent still had the assistance of the treasured lotus that he had summoned earlier. It could be seen that this was no ordinary item, and it might even be related to the broken item. Not only was it able to defend itself well, but it also had a faint ability to devour mana. Fortunately, he wasn't completely without help. With a thought, golden light flashed, and the Tai golden bead flew out. If this treasure was used alone, it would not be able to pose any threat to the mighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm, but it was different when combined with his mana. Just now, he had learned the art of raising mana, so he could also use it on the Tai golden bead. The power of this object was already endless, and now that his power was stacked with it, the power that burst forth would be even more powerful. Boom! The Tai golden bead smashed fiercely onto Pauline with immeasurable force. Priest Zhou's sea of magic power, which had been extremely stable, was instantly torn apart, and a hole was torn in the wall that he had carefully maintained. He was shocked and hurriedly changed his mind, closing the crack. At the same time, he glanced over and saw the golden light. He couldn't help but be slightly surprised and said, "Primordial treasure." Then he sighed regretfully. He could see that this treasure was born from Busu Tian, and originally there was karma to be found. Unfortunately, this treasure was complete, without any leaks or impurities. Apart from the worshipper, it would not be touched by anything else, and it was even more difficult to absorb qi from it. Unless it was seized, there would be no useful clues to be found on it. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. Even though the hole was quickly covered up, that sliver was enough for him to discover the location of the main world. He immediately separated a strand of his consciousness and invaded the main world. Usually, as long as he disturbed it a little, he would be able to destroy all the changes in its evolution. But just now his consciousness had entered, and before it could truly cause a storm, it was intercepted by a consciousness that was almost as strong as his. Thus, the two of them were in a deadlock, and he couldn't do anything else. He immediately realized that Priest Zhou was very much like Daoren. After entering the present world, he didn't do anything, and instead waited here for him. This was probably to prevent him from interfering, just in case. He thought about it. This situation had to be changed as soon as possible, because this was the present world that Priest Zhou had opened up, and it could be said that he had the home advantage. Although Priest Zhou didn't deliberately push it forward, the present world would still evolve in the direction he wanted. When the evolution reached its end, he might achieve his wish. And at this time, if he wanted to break out of this situation, he could only find someone he liked in the present world and destroy Priest Zhou's various arrangements. This person must have a close karmic connection with him, because the deeper the connection, the more he would be able to carry Priest Zhou's will. From this point of view, his own disciples were the most suitable, especially his eldest disciple, Lu Yenny. She was born with great talent and came from Qinsang school. With his guidance, she would definitely be able to stop Priest Zhou. However, there was one thing that needed to be noted. In this battle for the present world, one could not only consider the present, but also the future. If this present world didn't succeed, then Priest Zhou would definitely open up the next one and continue to search for Bushutian. He would also learn from the previous lesson and try to erase the person who carried his will, cutting off this karmic connection. Thus, when he waited for the next present world, it was very likely that Lu Yenny would no longer appear. Of course, he could continue to search for other disciples, but Priest Zhou could also erase them one by one until there was no one left for him to entrust his will to. Logically speaking, even if he randomly chose a cultivator, he could still destroy Priest Zhou's arrangements with his help. However, he had to consider one thing. The longer the evolution of the present world was delayed, the closer Priest Zhou would get to Bushutian, and this advantage would accumulate. This way, no matter how many times he destroyed the present world, in the end, Priest Zhou could still achieve his goal. In other words, even if he won all the battles in the present world, it was very likely that he would lose to Priest Zhou in the grand scheme of things. After considering all of this, he felt that there was actually a mystery here. There was actually one person in the present world who could not only be entrusted to him, but was also not afraid of being erased. That was his previous self. In reality, from the moment his consciousness was born, it had been separated from his previous self. The side that was him had already transcended, but the side that was his previous self still existed. Therefore, after the creation of this very similar present world, he could be sure that his previous self still existed. Because this body of his had started from his previous self, that previous self was someone else, but at the same time, he was himself. Because of this, his previous self became the person who had missed the heavenly secrets. Priest Zhou could not see his existence, and because he could not find him, even if he went to the next present world, he would not be able to erase him. Thinking of this, he immediately turned his mind, following that thread of karma, and entrusted that strand of consciousness to it. He did not need this previous self to reach his current level, that was also impossible. He only needed to find a way to destroy the possibility of Priest Zhou reaching Bushutian, and that would be enough. Not long after, this present world evolved to its end. As he wished, he did not give Priest Zhou any chance. Priest Zhou did not mind, and immediately used his magic power to create another present world. This time, he still did not succeed, but he did not show any disappointment. He continued because he believed that as long as he continued, he would eventually be able to reap the fruits of his labor. However, not long after, he found that something was wrong. No matter how he created the present world, he would always encounter failure at a certain stage, and he could not find the source of the failure here. After many attempts, he was finally sure that Zhang Yan had most likely found a way to restrict him, but he could not divert his attention to look. After all, the pressure that Zhang Yan gave him was not just for show. If he was not careful, he would be crushed. After trying a few more times, he knew that he had lost the opportunity to find Bushutian, so he no longer created the present world. He withdrew his magic power, showing that he wanted to stop fighting. Zhang Yan understood that with his current methods, he could not do anything to Priest Zhou, and there was no point in continuing to fight. It was better to stop while he was ahead, so he slowly calmed down his magic power. Priest Zhou looked at him deeply and said, "Dao friend, you are a level higher. I cannot fulfill my wish today, but that does not mean you will win. If you are not willing to open the door, not just me, everyone who knows about this will come looking for you in the future." With that, he bowed, waved his sleeve, and left. Soon, his figure disappeared into the silence. Zhang Yan understood what this person meant. If Daoist Zhou felt that he alone could not force him to open the door, then the next time he came, he would most likely join forces with people from the Tao of Virtue to cause trouble for him. Perhaps even people from the entire Tao would come knocking on his door. If it was before, he would definitely take the initiative to go to them before they found him and eliminate the threat separately. However, it was almost impossible to kill spirit refinement cultivators. Moreover, if they realized their intentions, they might attract more enemies, so it was not appropriate to do so. Other than that, there was another way to deal with this, and that was to find allies. The first one he thought of was Quan Dao, but they did not know what happened in the modern world. Even if they knew, it was only a battle of wills, and it was not a big deal. However, if he found this person and Priest Zhou revealed the news of Bushutian, then they would definitely ask him to open the door or directly rob him. If that was the case, there was actually a solution. However, the most important thing was that he did not know what the agreement between Quan Dao and Virtue Dao was. If they were working together more closely than he imagined, then it was not advisable to rashly go looking for them. Other than that, he actually had two choices. One was to see if he could find the great underworld patriarch. After all, he came from the Qinsang school, so they were naturally on the same side. It was not that there were no clues here. In the modern world he created, there was a force that was suspected to be related to the great underworld patriarch, but he had never gone to disturb them before. Now, he could go looking for them. There was another way. Since so many spirit cultivators were chasing after Bushutian, there must be some hidden secret. Then he could go back to where he came from and enter Bushutian to look for opportunities. If he could obtain something important before this person arrived, then he might not have to fear this person. He pondered deeply and decided to first find that force. If there was no result, then he would make another choice. Chapter 1939. With a thought, Zhang Yan sent a strand of his consciousness into the present world he had created. The situation in this world was the same as before. The only difference was that the heavenly court no longer existed, and all the Qi practitioners who were directly related to it, as well as the itinerant immortals who served as immortal officials in the heavenly court, had also disappeared. For the people of this world, the heavenly court was already separated from the mortal world, and they would never see it again. There were pros and cons to this. Without the heavenly court, there would be no one to control the dynasties in the mortal world. Without the gods, there would be no need to worship them, but there would also be no Star Lord to suppress the demons of the various heavens, and there would be no more Qi practitioners and itinerant immortals. Even though they had been suppressed by the heavenly court for a long time, if there was no one to control them, they would definitely reach out to the mortal world to ask for cultivation items, and fill in the gap after the heavenly court left. But because many Qi practitioners were not from the same sect, the future of this world would definitely develop differently. In this world, the only ones who could transcend the world were the people under the Grand Supreme Sect. Not just Forgottenly Mountain, but also the people of virtue and integrity. However, if the latter did not see their Grand Supreme Sect, they would definitely not dare to come out again. Of course. If Zhang Yan was willing to return the fragment to this world again, not only would the heavenly court appear again, the order of the various heavens would also return to its original state. But he naturally would not do that, because once the present world collapsed, the fragment would naturally disappear with it. At this moment, he sensed a place that was suspected to be related to the great underworld ancestral master. This force was located in a remote corner of the various heavens, and its strength was not weaker than the other sections. Previously, when the princes fought, almost half of the worlds with Qi practitioners were involved, but it had coldly watched from the sidelines, not stirring up any trouble. Perhaps it had already foreseen the possible consequences, so it did not get involved. He immediately found Wang Guang, gave him some instructions, and ordered him to make a trip to this force. After receiving the order, Wang Guang descended Forgottenly Mountain, crossed the Realm River, and soon arrived at Rolling Spirit Great Heaven. The spiritual vigor of this heaven and earth was neither strong nor weak, it was just normal. There were many itinerant immortals, but there were no big sections. The celestial court paid little attention to this place. However, when he looked over now, because the celestial court was no longer suppressing, other than the cities and gathering places where mortals lived, the wilderness was filled with demons and ghosts. However, none of this had anything to do with him. After sensing for a bit, he found the location that Zhang Yan had told him about. With a thought, he instantly arrived above the boundary. Looking down from above, there was a dense fog, and he couldn't see clearly. There should be a great formation covering it. After a few more glances, he discovered that there was an exit that led straight inside. This should be a path that the owner of this place had intentionally left behind. He pondered for a moment. Since he was here to search, he naturally couldn't force his way in. Thus, he descended and arrived in front of a mountain wall. There was a gap filled with hanging vines. As he walked forward, the vines naturally separated into two sides. The path in the cave was winding, and after walking 1,000 steps, the two sides of the path lit up, and the path under his feet became flat and straight. After a long time, there was light, and he knew he had reached the exit. He stepped out, and his eyes widened. In front of him was a river plain, and the north side was against a verdant mountain. Many farmers were farming here, and it did not look like a place of cultivation, but a paradise. Dandy Guang looked over and saw 2 rays of spiritual light shooting into the sky, and he knew that was where the owner was. Since there were restrictions everywhere, and he was in someone else's mountain, he did not use the cloud to escape, and instead walked on foot. When the farmers saw an unfamiliar Taoist, they were all shocked and stopped what they were doing. An old farmer put down his hoe, wiped his sweat, and bowed to the side of the road, asking, "Did Taoist come from outside the mountain?" Dandy Guang stopped and said, "Yes." The old farmer sighed. Ever since the outside world was in chaos, there have been very few outsiders coming here. Dandy Guang said, "Did you come here often?" The old farmer said, "The two mountain masters have many friends, and they would bring some juniors and disciples here for a banquet. However, in the past few decades, other than a Taoist who came here often, I have not seen anyone else." Dandy Guang nodded, and after saying goodbye, he walked up the mountain. He walked along a flower stream, and at the corner, he saw a waterfall. In front of the waterfall, there was a big stone beside the pond, and two Taoists were sitting there playing chess. They looked very engrossed in the game, and they did not notice the person beside them. There was a boy standing beside them, and when he saw him, he was about to remind him, but Dandy Guang waved his hand at him. The boy was smart, and after bowing to him, he didn't say anything. However, he took the copper pot and poured a cup of fragrant tea. He came down from the stone and offered it to Dandy Guang, saying, "Please enjoy." After Dandy Guang took it, he nodded at him, and the boy bowed to him and left respectfully. This game of chess took the two Taoists more than half a month, and it finally came to an end. Dandy Guang was not in a hurry. Before he came here, Zhang Yan told him that he was here to find a method of fate. He didn't care how long it would take, and he just had to follow his heart. At this moment, one of the Taoists with a jade face and red beard held a chess piece and pondered for a long time. In the end, he couldn't find a way to solve the situation, so he laughed and threw the chess piece back into the stone box. With a loud voice, he said, "Taoist Yulu won." Taoist Yulu smiled, and pointed downwards, saying, "Taoist Quan Lai, this chess piece made of Bai Wei stone should have lost to me, right?" The red-beard Taoist was very pained, and he sighed, as if he couldn't bear to watch anymore. He turned around and waved his hand, saying, "Take it, take it." Taoist Yulu smiled, and with a wave of his sleeve, he kept the chess piece. At this moment, he noticed Dandy Guang standing there, and said, "Taoist Quan Lai, you have a guest." Taoist Quan Lai quickly got up, and came down from the stone. He bowed to Dandy Guang, and said, "Sorry for the delay, please don't blame me." Dandy Guang bowed back, and smiled, "It's fine." He knew that the two of them really didn't notice his arrival. Of course, it didn't mean that the two of them were defenseless. This place was filled with restrictive formations, and if someone with ill intentions was here, he would have been alerted long ago. After greeting each other, Taoist Quan Lai asked curiously, "May I know where did you come from, and which celestial mountain are you cultivating at?" Dandy Guang said, "I am cultivating at Mount Li Wang." "Oh." The two of them were surprised, and Taoist Yulu bowed solemnly, and said, "Oh, you're a disciple of the Supreme Sect? Please excuse me." Taoist Quan Lai asked curiously, "Why did you come to my cultivation place?" If it was during the Battle of the Heaven Court, he was worried that Mount Li Wang would drag him out to fight with others. But the world was already settled, and the Heaven Court was gone. Celestials were cut off from contact, and such things would never happen again. Taoist Yulu interrupted, "This is not a place to entertain guests, why don't you invite the immortal into the hall?" Taoist Quan Lai said apologetically, yes, it's my fault." Dandy Guang didn't mind. Taoist Quan Lai was obviously a person who didn't care about trifles, and this kind of person was easier to talk to. A slight lack of etiquette was not a big deal. Taoist Quan Lai then invited Dandy Guang to the peak of the mountain. When Dandy came up, he saw that the place was flat, and along the way, there were many temples and there were at least 1,000 Qi practitioners cultivating here. Each and every one of them had a strong cultivation base, and it was obvious that this sect's inheritance was orderly, and their cultivation techniques were also superior. The three of them entered the temple and sat down in an open hall. When they turned around, they could see the scenery outside. When Dandy looked over, he saw a sea of waves, and he couldn't help but nod. "May I know what is the name of your sect?" Taoist Quan Lai quickly said, "I dare not call myself a sect." Since the time of our grandmaster, although I inherited Tao arts, I have never established my own sect. Dandy Guang asked, why is that? Taoist Quan Lai said, our grandmaster once said that he came from a big sect, and without the permission of the elders, he dared not establish his own sect. Hence, the later generations have been doing the same. Dandy Guang said, the formation outside is very strong, and ordinary means can't break it. Is it your grandmaster's doing? Taoist Quan Lai laughed, that is my teacher's doing. Dandy Guang said, is your grandmaster still around? Taoist Quan Lai shook his head, he has long passed away. As he said this, he suddenly paused, as if he remembered something. He stroked his beard and stared at Dandy Guang for a while, then stood up and said, Taoist, please follow me. As he said this, he hurriedly walked forward. Dandy Guang didn't say anything, but followed him. Taoist Yulu thought for a while, but he didn't move, and just sat there without moving. Taoist Quan Lai walked in front, and arrived in front of a stone wall. He waved his sleeves, and a mist of light rose from above. He then called out to Dandy Guang, and stepped inside. After Dandy Guang entered, he took a look around. He could tell that this was originally a place for cultivation, but it had been a long time since anyone came here. Taoist Quan Lai waved his hand, and an item fell from the top of the wall. He handed it to Dandy Guang, and said hurriedly, Taoist, please take a look at this. Dandy Guang took a look, and saw that it was a jade plate with lines of veins carved on it. However, when he poured his mana into it, it was like a clay ox entering the sea, and there was no reaction at all. This proved that this item was not simple, so he silently called out the Grandmaster's name in his heart. Zhang Yan had already sensed that the jade plate was carved with an ordinary heart sutra, but it wasn't difficult to identify it. It came from the same source as Qinsang school. He couldn't help but confirm his judgment, and immediately passed the sutra to Dandy Guang. After listening to it, Dandy Guang followed the sutra, and a glowing chi appeared on the jade plate, and at the same time, there was the sound of rolling waves, and a map was revealed. Taoist Quan Lai saw this, and showed an excited expression, and said, this is it, this is it. Dandy Guang said, may I know what this is? Taoist Quan Lai calmed himself down, and said, you may not know this, but before the Grandmaster left, he said that if anyone came to ask about the origin of the sect, this item can be shown to the person. If the person is fated to open it, then the person will be able to find the map to the sect. However, after the Grandmaster left, no one could see anything special about it. Just now, I almost forgot about this. Dandy Guang heard this, and knew that this jade plate was very important. He thought for a while, and bowed, and said, if it's convenient, can you come with I to Mount Li Wang? Chapter 1940. Taoist Quan Lai was startled, this, immortal elder, why do you want to go to the Forgotten Mountain? He looked at the jade plate, is there something wrong with this item? Wang Guang said, it's not that. It's just that there's something special about this item. The map I is also hard to decipher. Perhaps the Grandmaster could see some clues and wanted to bring it to the Grandmaster to have a look. Are you willing to do so? Taoist Quan Lai was also eager to find the location of his sect. Moreover, it was impossible for the Grand Supreme to covet his item. Hence, he said, all right, I'll have to trouble you then. I'll go with you after I make some arrangements. He found another disciple named Quanan and told him about the matter. He then followed Wang Guang to the Forgotten Mountain. Wang Guang cast a spell and in a moment, they arrived at the boundary. They got off the conveyance light and headed up the mountain. Taoist Quan Lai couldn't help but ask, Immortal Elder, is this item related to the Forgotten Mountain? Wang Guang said, I'm not sure about this. You'll know when you meet the Grandmaster. Quan Lai nodded and said, all right. He was a little excited. The Taishang Taoist ancestor was untainted by thousands of tribulations and had an eternal life. In his mind, his cultivation was perfect. Other than the true immortals under the Taishang sect, no one else was lucky enough to meet him. The two arrived at the peak of the mountain. After reporting to the Taoist palace, a boy called them in. Taoist Quan Lai followed Wang Guang to the grand hall. When he looked up, he saw a black-robed Taoist sitting on the jade platform. Under the illumination of the clear qi and mysterious light, there was a five-colored divine radiance rotating behind him. It was impossible to see clearly. He knew that this was the Taishang Taoist ancestor. He quickly went forward and bowed. "I'm Taoist Quan Lai." "Greetings, Grand Supreme." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Mountain Master Quan Lai, there's no need to stand on ceremony. I know about you. I invited you here today because your Grandmaster might be related to me." Quan Lai was stunned when he heard this. He had never thought that his founding ancestor would be related to the Grand Supreme. He was surprised and terrified at the same time. This little Taoist. After a while, he seemed to have come to his senses. He slapped his head and raised the jade plate in his hand. "Grand Supreme, the jade plate passed down by my founding ancestor is here, please take a look." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. His gaze fell on it, and the item slowly floated in front of him. He stared at it for a moment, intending to watch it pass by, but all he saw was darkness, and he couldn't help but be moved. He then stretched out his finger and pointed at it. Layers of halos appeared above it. After a brief examination, he was sure that although this item was not a primordial treasure, its origin was not simple. It had already transcended the hindrance of the present world and could reflect itself into the present world like a deity refinement almighty. Therefore, what he saw was an existence similar to the consciousness of the deity refinement almighty. In other words, it was a reflection. The real body of this item was still in the void. Now that it was reflected in the present world, it must have been attracted by something. From his senses and Taoist Quan Lai's cultivation method, this jade plate was indeed related to the great underworld grandmaster. However, there was a question. Was this item left behind by the great underworld grandmaster on purpose, or was it simply because of the karmic connection that it was attracted here? He thought about it carefully and felt that the latter was more likely. This was because other than the deity refinement almighty, no one else could see the real face of this item. Moreover, the great underworld grandmaster did not have to do so. Even if he wanted to leave something for his disciples, he had more options. For example, when he guided him to look for the mystic stone, it would at least point him in the right direction. However, there was nothing here. It was more like it was accidentally left outside. Of course, there might be unexpected situations. As he thought about this, he could not help but think about the scene that the fragment showed. As for the grandmaster that Taoist Quan Lai mentioned, it was very likely that he was a disciple of the great underworld grandmaster. That was why he had the image of this item. Therefore, he looked at Taoist Quan Lai and observed his past to see if he could find any clues. If there was a deity refinement almighty behind him, or someone who was more powerful than him, then he would definitely not be able to see much. It was like if someone wanted to observe his disciples, then the deeper the relationship with him, the harder it would be for him to observe. If it was an ordinary disciple, he would still be able to see some intermittent scenes. If he probed deeper, he might even be alerted. However, it would be best if he alerted the great underworld grandmaster. It would save him a lot of trouble. He soon saw the scene of his master accepting him into the sect. Then, he saw the scene of his master accepting him as a disciple. From generation to generation, everything was still vivid in his mind. Not long after, he saw the first Tao inheritance. He saw a young man kowtowing. In front of him stood the shadow of a Taoist, and beneath his feet was a jade plate that was exactly the same as the one in his hand. Zhang Yan saw this and nodded slightly. He had already figured out the sequence of events. In reality, the Grandmaster Quan Lai did not really exist. To be precise, he did not exist in this current world. He was someone from another current world. He was originally holding the jade plate, and accidentally triggered a trace of the item's mysteriousness. Thus, he was able to entrust his divine will into the item. Because the jade plate existed in many current worlds, when he created this current world, due to the connection of karma, a projection was reflected in this world. Perhaps due to coincidence, the divine will was also brought in. Thus, this strand of divine will pass down this lineage of Tao. However, he was only a divine will after all. His cultivation was limited, so he did not know where he was. He only knew that the jade plate was the key. Thus, he passed down a map on it and left some instructions. He hoped that one day, his disciples would be fortunate enough to meet someone who was related to his sect and use this opportunity to find him. Zhang Yan's heart moved. A strand of his consciousness came out and walked in front of the Taoist's shadow. He asked, "May I know who your sect is?" The Taoist figure just looked at him blankly, but didn't say anything. Zhang Yan couldn't help but shake his head. There was a limit to how much the divine will could carry. Moreover, the patriarch might be involved, so it was hard for him to see more. Thus, he retracted his consciousness and allowed the past to dissipate. He looked at the jade plate in front of him again. The map on it was useless to him. As long as he could find the world where that Taoist originally existed, it would not be difficult to find the location of that sect. However, it was hard to say if he would only be able to find this sect or if he would be able to find the great underworld ancestral master. However, it was still a clue. He pondered for a moment and said to Taoist Quan Lai, who was waiting below the jade platform, "Mountain Chieftain Quan Lai, I'm afraid it's going to be difficult to find the original sect." Taoist Quan Lai was startled. "Why?" "Could it be," Zhang Yan said, "it's not that there's something wrong with the sect. There's something strange about this place. With your cultivation base, it's hard for you to find the location of the sect." Taoist Quan Lai couldn't help but feel a little dejected. He thought that it was because his cultivation base was not up to par, which was why the sect could not accept him. However, he also knew that it was impossible for him to improve after cultivating for so long. His wish of paying respects to the patriarch of the sect might not be fulfilled in this lifetime. He hesitated for a moment and suddenly prostrated himself on the ground. He bowed deeply and said, "Can you please tell me the name of my patriarch and the name of the sect? Even if I can't find the sect, I can still tell my disciples about the origin of the heritage. In the future, I can also have a worshipper in the Hall of Patriarchs." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. It was not an unreasonable request. Moreover, he borrowed the jade plate from Taoist Quan Lai, so he should return the favor. Thus, he said, "Please wait patiently. I'll tell you once I'm done investigating." Taoist Quan Lai heard this and bowed deeply again. "Thank you, Grand Elder." Zhang Yan didn't speak anymore. Dongguang knew what was going on and walked to Taoist Quan Lai's side. He said, "Taoist friend Quan Lai, I'm afraid the patriarch is going to cast his spell later. We'll take our leave first." Taoist Quan Lai agreed, stood up and bowed before leaving with Dongguang. Zhang Yan waited for the both of them to leave. Then, he used the jade plate in his hand to try to find its original location. In the eyes of the original, countless ups and downs of the present world flashed by in an instant. After a long time, he gradually found out the location of the original by relying on the reflection of the item. However, when he was about to find it, he raised his brows. Due to the disturbance of the spirit enhancement Whaley outside, the jade plate actually broke away from his senses. It wasn't impossible to grab it by force. With his mana, he only needed to push the Whaley away. However, if he did that, Taoist Shou would definitely notice his actions. He might even notice what he was looking for. If he got it before Taoist Shou did, it wouldn't be worth it. Therefore, he could only take it slow. Among these, he had to be careful. Although Taoist Shou retreated the last time, he definitely wouldn't give up the chance to enter Bu Su Heaven. It was just that he didn't know when he would come looking for him again. It wouldn't be good if he dragged this matter out for too long. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment before he allowed his main body to continue searching for the jade plate. Meanwhile, he took out the fragment and transferred his consciousness into it. At this moment, in a trance, he realized that he seemed to have sunk into an empty place. However, before he could comprehend it in detail, he returned to where he was a moment later. Even if he tried to probe deeper, he would at most repeat what he sensed before. There wouldn't be any additional changes. He nodded and understood the reason. It was because this item was only a fragment, so it was difficult for him to comprehend more from it. As for Taoist Zhou, because he had been searching for this item for a long time, it was possible that he had a lot of it. He was a person of virtue. If they worked together, it was possible that they could comprehend this item together. If that was the case, then the gains here wouldn't be small. They might just be missing an opportunity to peek into a more profound realm. Therefore, no matter what, he couldn't find Busu Heaven. Chapter 1941. In the depths of the void, Ancestor Yao Han was sitting cross-legged on a reed platform, calculating the mysteries of the world. At this moment, there were waves of mana fluctuations in the surroundings. Then, a clear light sprinkled over and broke the darkness. Two Taoists suddenly appeared on the reed platform. At this moment, other than the auspicious light where the three of them were at, there was only the long river in the chaotic world that rose and fell like the tide. Ancestor Yao Han stood up and bowed. Fellow Taoist Yu Lu, fellow Taoist Yu Qiu, greetings. If Zhang Yan was here, he would be able to recognize Yu Lu and Yu Qiu as the other two exalted Taoists of virtue and Tao. However, the name of virtue and Tao was only used in the modern world. The three of them greeted each other with their original Tao names and never mentioned the titles of respect in the modern world. Just like Ancestor Yao Han, the Yuxiao school's ancestor Zhou was formed from a strand of his consciousness. Zhang Yan called him fellow Taoist Zhou, but it was only to clarify his identity and not his real surname. After the greetings, Taoist Yu Qiu said with a smile, "Did fellow Taoist Yao Han summon us today because you found the creation fragment again?" Although the three of them were allies, they didn't have much contact other than exchanging insights after finding the creation fragment. Ancestor Yao Han said, "It is related to that, but what I saw today is not something an ordinary creation fragment can compare to." Taoist Yu Lu said, "I'd like to hear the details." Ancestor Yao Han briefly explained what happened, including the karma between him and Zhang Yan. He said, "Bushutian is the strongest creation fragment in existence. If I can get my hands on it, it will be a great help to my cultivation." Taoist Yu Qiu laughed. He could tell that Ancestor Yao Han wanted to take down Bushutian by himself, but he suffered a setback, so he came to find the two of them. However, he didn't reveal this matter. Although the three of them had an agreement, whoever obtained the fragment first would be the one to comprehend it. If others wanted to comprehend it, they would have to exchange for it. If they could get their hands on it, then it would be a sign of their ability. He asked, "Then what does Tao friend Yao Han want to do?" Patriarch Yao Han said, "He's alone, and he doesn't have any helpers. If the three of us work together, we should be able to subdue him and force him to open the door so we can take the cloth." Taoist Yu Qiu shook his head and said, "Inappropriate, inappropriate." He clearly did not agree with using fighting to solve the problem. "Fellow Taoist Yao Han, we still have opponents out there. How can we make enemies out of nothing? I believe that we shouldn't use force if we can." Ancestor Yao Han advised, "Fellow Taoists, with the three of us working together, we have a high chance of winning. If we hesitate, we will only miss this opportunity." At this time, Taoist Jade Leek said, "We do have a good chance of winning, but from what fellow Taoist Yao Han said, that Taoist Zhang is not easy to deal with. If we want to subdue him, we'll have to wear him down for a long time. Let's not talk about those two who are always watching us, fellow Taoist Zhou, have you forgotten about that one?" As he said this, he pointed to the depths of the void. Ancestor Yao Han's expression became serious, and after a while, he slowly said, "But no one knows if he really exists." Taoist Jade Leek said in a deep voice, "But you and I will not have such a feeling out of thin air. If this person really exists, then we must avoid fighting as much as possible and not give him any opportunity to take advantage of us." Ancestor Yao Han said, "If I don't take Busu Tian, someone else will. If you think we can't use force, then how?" Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Why don't we discuss it? If we accept this person, then won't Busu Tian be in our bag?" Ancestor Yao Han denied, "That method has no chance of success." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Why not? If we do this, we can exchange fragments with him." Fellow Taoist Zhang's clan will also benefit, and we can avoid a fight. Why not? Ancestor Yao Han said plainly. He might not believe me. Hearing this, Taoist Yu Qiu and Taoist Yu Qiu immediately understood. Lower realm cultivators were bound by oaths, but at the spirit refinement realm, there was nothing to bind them. They could only rely on promises, but the premise was that both sides had to trust each other. Ancestor Yao Han and Zhang Yan had karmic ties, and they had just fought not long ago. How could they convince him that they came with good intentions? Taoist Yu Qiu took a deep look at Ancestor Yao Han. He believed that it was impossible for this person to not have thought of this beforehand. The reason he had done this before was to intentionally cut off this path. It was impossible to say that this was because of the karma of the past. That was just a battle of wills in the present world. To them, there was no need to be entangled with it, so there must be another reason behind this. At this time, Taoist Jade Leek said, if fellow Taoist Yao Han had told us about this earlier when he discovered that Taoist Zhang, then with the combined strength of the three of us, we might be able to suppress this person. But now, the method of forceful suppression is no longer feasible. If I am unable to send that Taoist Zhang into eternal silence, the more we fight him, the more he will benefit. Doing this will instead give him an advantage. When spirit refinement cultivators fought against each other, they were also fusing. Although Zhang Yan had become a spirit refinement cultivator, he still had many techniques that he had yet to master. This could only be seen in a battle with someone of the same generation. Ancestor Yao Han's battle with him allowed him to understand many changes. Taoist Yu Qiu thought that it was better not to use force. If he succeeded, then it would be good, but if he failed, then it would only benefit Taoist Zhang. Taoist Yu Qiu agreed, that's right. If the two of them attacked while we were fighting, not only would we not gain anything, we might even end up benefiting them. Fortunately, Taoist Zhang will eventually enter Bu Su Tian. When he opens the door, we will have a chance. Ancestor Yao Han said, that doesn't seem to be of much use. If Taoist Zhang opens the door, his mana will spread inside, and no one will be able to enter. If they wanted to project their mana into the real world, then they had to do it before the real world had fully evolved. Just now was easy to do. If it was fully developed, and it had already been contaminated by the mana of a spirit refinement cultivator, then it would be difficult for outsiders to enter. At most, they would be able to affect it slightly. But such an action would be meaningless, because it would be quickly wiped out by the opponent. This was just like the world that Zhang Yan had opened up in order to break through to the spirit refinement realm. In the beginning, there were people of virtue and integrity, and even the jade plate that shone in. However, after he expelled all external forces, he was no longer afraid of the invasion of external laws. The real world with Bu Su Tian was the same. If Zhang Yan didn't release his mana, then no one would be able to enter. Taoist Yu Qiu said, Taoist Yao Han, did you use karma to try to deduce Bu Su Tian's location? Ancestor Yao Han said, Taoist Zhang seems to have another method. No matter how many times I tried to create the real world, I was always stopped halfway. I couldn't find the reason. Taoist Yu Qiu smiled and said, Taoist Zhang wanted to find the right fruit, so you stole the heaven secret. But stealing is not as good as inviting. Ancestor Yao Han said, oh. I wonder if fellow friend has any brilliant ideas. Taoist Yu Qiu opened his palm, and a green seedling floated out. There were many branches growing on it. It was a real world, but it hadn't evolved yet. Taoist Yao Han said that when you fought with Taoist Zhang, you saw a lot of karma. Then we can use this karma to move this real world and use our consciousness to point to the Tao fruit. After a long time, the boundary between the two worlds will be blurred. When the time comes, we can take over this world and find Bu Su Tian. If a spirit refinement realm expert believed that the real world would change in the future, it would evolve in that direction if there wasn't enough outside interference. What he meant was to use the karma ancestor Yao Han borrowed from Zhang Yan to create a real world. Then, the three of them placed their magic power in one place and believed that the real world they created would eventually evolve into a place that led to Bu Su Tian. If they succeeded, they would have a high chance of replacing the real world behind Zhang Yan. But the prerequisite was that they had to block all outside interference from the Weili. Putting aside the others, Zhang Yan would definitely make a move once he sensed it. However, with the three of them fighting against one person, they still had the advantage. Daoist Yu Qiu nodded and said, "This is a good method. There is no need to fight with Daoist Zhang directly. Even if there is outside interference, we can deal with it at any time." In reality, there were still many loopholes that could be exploited. However, nothing was perfect in this world. There were bound to be loopholes. As long as they dealt with it and made up for it in time, it would be fine. Therefore, when the time came, it would all depend on their own methods. Daoist Yu Qiu looked at Ancestor Yao Han and asked, "What do you think, Daoist Yao Han?" Ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment and nodded. He was actually more inclined to use forceful methods, but since the two of them wanted this method, he could only agree. He looked at the sapling and said, "That Daoist Zhang has some tricks up his sleeve. If we want to do this, we need to focus on dealing with him. We need to make sure those people don't come looking for us." Daoist Yu Qiu said, "We can do this. We will exchange some creation fragments with him. If those people obtain them, they will only focus on comprehending and won't care about outside matters. This way, we can stabilize this junior." Ancestor Yao Han said, "That's not appropriate. If I take the initiative, it will make this junior suspicious." Daoist Yu Qiu said, "What do you think, Daoist Yao Han?" Ancestor Yao Han looked at the two of them and said, "How about this? We will exchange the creation fragments we found last time with this junior. That way, even if they know we have a plan, they will only focus on comprehending and won't disturb us." Hearing this, Daoist Yu Qiu and Daoist Yu Qiu fell into deep thought. The good fortune fragment that Ancestor Yao Han mentioned was something that they had spent a lot of effort to obtain. Even they hadn't fully comprehended it. If they took it out for an exchange, they would be able to keep those people safe for a long time, but they would have to take it back in the future. However, if they could really obtain Bushutian, it would be worth it even if they had to give it up. Daoist Yu Qiu thought about it and agreed, this is the only way to appease those people. "I think it is feasible." Daoist Yu Qiu also nodded and said, "Let's do it." Chapter 1942. Ancestor Yao Han and the other two decided to pay a visit to their peers in order to avoid any accidents. Just as they'd judged earlier, even though the other party knew what they were planning, the good fortune fragment that they'd been yearning for was right before their eyes, and they couldn't miss such an opportunity no matter what. Thus, they accepted it and promised to exchange it for something of equal value in the future. After this was done, Ancestor Yao Han said, "This should be enough to keep this junior in check for a while. However, we must succeed this time, or else it will be difficult to make up for the losses here." Daoist Yu Lu said, "With the three of us working together, if we still can't take Bushutian from Daoist Zhang, then we won't be able to obtain this item." Daoist Yu Qiu had a carefree appearance instead, and he said with a smile, "Just do your best." He opened his palm, and the sapling floated out and landed among the three. He said, "Fellow Daoist Yao Han, I'll have to trouble you." Ancestor Yao Han waved his sleeve, and the sapling immediately became livelier as if it had awakened from a state of no beginning and no end. This was the karmic connection. In just a moment, the sapling slowly grew. From the creation of the world to its complete evolution, if there was no interference from the mana of the same generation, then it would only take an instant. This kind of interference was not only due to external forces, but also the pressure between them. This was something that even allies could not avoid unless their cultivation was at a higher level. Rumor had it that once they reached that level, they could hide in the void and would not be affected by the mana of the same generation. On the other side, Zhang Yan was spiritually traveling through the void, trying to find the location of the jade plate. The moment the three of them cast their spells, he felt something was wrong. Due to the confrontation of magic power and the fact that this matter was connected to him by karma, Patriarch Yao Han and the others couldn't hide their actions from him. In fact, the three of them didn't expect to be able to get past him, so they had already taken precautions. He made a slight deduction in his heart and immediately knew the origin of the past. Moreover, it could be deduced that if this junior succeeded this time, he would be able to replace the real world behind him. This way, this junior would be able to easily find Busu Tian. With a thought, a vast amount of mana was lifted up, and just like a high-stacked wave, it pressed towards the three of them. Patriarch Yao Han and the other two felt the pressure increase. Although they believed they had the advantage, they couldn't be sure what the other side was thinking. Right now, they needed to avoid fighting as much as possible. But if Zhang Yan came looking for them, that wouldn't be something they wanted to see. This wasn't because they feared him, but because they wanted to avoid trouble. If they fought, it would only give others a chance to covet them. When Zhang Yan's transcendence energy collided with it, he felt 3 streams of Wei Li blocking his way. If he wanted to wear them down, he did not know how long it would take. Clearly, this was not the best plan. Fortunately, he was just testing the waters and did not really expect to be able to overwhelm his opponent. He thought about it. The other side had undoubtedly made all their preparations. Even if he really went to their door, he might not be able to change anything. He could only start with the real world that the other side had created and see if he could solve the problem from the root. Thus, he first looked into the depths of the void and saw a sapling full of vitality. In an instant, he could clearly see the inside and the outside, and he understood all the changes. In order to blur the line between reality and illusion, Patriarch Yao Han had made the evolution of the real world very similar to the one behind him. But because he was not there, there were still many differences. However, they did not want to create an exact replica of the present world. Instead, they wanted to find Bushutian, and their ultimate goal was to reach this place. Therefore, everything would naturally evolve in this direction. Even if there was no one who could break the boundary, one would appear due to the wishes of the 3 of them. However, the worst situation was not yet here. He could foresee that if this person succeeded, not only would Bushutian be lost, but everything in the original real world would also be replaced by the real world created by this person. Some of the original people would still exist, while others would disappear. And even those who still existed would not necessarily be the original ones. His eyes darkened. Even if it was not to protect Bushutian, he had to find a way to stop this. Just now, he had already tried it, and it was impossible to interfere from the front. The 3's transcendence energy was like a sturdy wall. That was the most secure place. If they crashed into it, not only would they not be able to break through, but they would also fall into the path prepared by the other side. Thus, they could only take a roundabout route. He silently calculated and found that although there were many flaws, they were covered up as much as possible by this person. Even if there was a loophole, they would be able to cover it up in time. However, no matter how strong the defenses were, there were still a few places that could be broken through. The 3 of them created the real world by borrowing the karma behind him. This was something this person could not avoid because everything had to have a direction. Without these karma, it would be impossible to find Bushutian. But it was also because of this that there was a door that he could interfere with. Because this person wanted to make use of the original karma, he could only guide it in a general direction and could not personally participate. Thus, the key was still the person in the real world who bore their hopes. If they could eliminate this person or cut off the path of cultivation, then they could stop the evolution of this world. This person was definitely in Yu Zhao's camp. It was not because the 3 of them had no other choice, but because this was the easiest way to achieve their goal. If they chose someone else and they were bewitched by the foreign Wei Li, then they would no longer be under his control. Even so, he could still influence some of the people with extraordinary foundations to stop this person. However, there was a problem. If he sent his consciousness in, he would definitely be expelled by the other party. This was not like the last time when he only had to face the Yao Han ancestor. There were 3 people there, and it was also this person's home ground. Even if he could use this deadlock, he would not have the strength to stop the evolution of this person. He pondered for a moment. In fact, he could find someone to share the pressure here. Due to the fact that this world had just been established, Quan Dao and Yi Zichen's consciousnesses would also enter this world. Although the two of them had been driven out by him in the previous world, due to the concealment of the Tai golden bead, the two of them did not know the specifics. However, even if they knew, it was just one of the countless battles in the world, and it was not worth mentioning to them. If he could rope the two of them in to fight with him against the three people on the Yao Han ancestors' side, then he would have a higher chance of defeating this person. With this thought, he immediately sent his consciousness into the real world. Then, he felt three powerful Wei forces coming over to expel him. However, this was not something that could be done in a short period of time. He thought about it and decided to resist this force. After searching for a while, he found a Dao palace in a nameless place. When he arrived, he saw two Taoists sitting in the hall. He cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoists." Usually, the consciousness of a spirit refinement cultivator would be different in every real world. Unless the main body was the one who came over, then it would be possible for the appearance to be the same. The two Taoists returned the greeting. The Taoist on the left said, "Fellow Taoist, why are you here?" Zhang Yan said, "Both of you should know that this world was created by the three of them. But do you understand why they are doing this?" The Taoist on the right said, "From your words, you seem to know the inside story." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "The three of them are trying to find an item." The Taoist on the left said, "The fragment of good fortune." Zhang Yan smiled and did not answer. However, although he did not admit it, the two Taoists clearly thought so. Moreover, they also wanted to obtain it. Thus, after a short discussion, the Taoist on the left said, "The two of us are currently comprehending a fragment of good fortune, so we don't have the time to care too much about this. However, this item cannot be easily found by the people of the Jade Leak. We are willing to help you, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "In that case, I thank the two of you." The two of them immediately activated their magic power and shared some of the pressure from Yao Han and the other two. Seeing that this matter had been discussed, Zhang Yan returned his spirit to his main body. However, he did not think that this was enough to make him feel at ease. It was not advisable to place all his hopes on these two. Since they were willing to ally with him for a temporary benefit, they could also give up on this matter for other reasons. In the end, he still had to rely on himself. He shook his sleeve and summoned the Tai golden bead. Then, it broke through many obstacles and smashed into the present world. This was a primordial treasure born from Busu Tian. When Ancestor Yao Han and the others tried all means to find Busu Tian, it was tantamount to them acknowledging that this item could enter the present world. Thus, they did not guard against it at all. There was a boom that shook the very foundation of the world. The present world's past and future were thrown into chaos. Patriarch Yao Han and the other two reacted in time, and in the blink of an eye, they were able to straighten things out. But now, even more holes were being exposed. Zhang Yan took this opportunity to effect a strand of karma and place it on one person. He was prepared to use this person to stop Ancestor Yao Han and the others' wishes. In the Netherworld Spring sect, a long-haired Taoist was floating above a Netherworld Spring. Just now, when he entered a meditative state, he did not know why, but he fell into a dreamlike state. In this state, he saw himself fighting with others in the future. In the end, he would die at the hands of a Yuxiao school disciple called Zhou Ji. Moreover, the scene was incomparably clear and deeply imprinted in his mind. While he was deep in thought, he heard someone call out, "Senior Brother Feng, enlightened Master Yuan requests your presence." The Taoist stood up and calmly said, "I understand. Report to Senior Brother Yuan, I will go immediately." Chapter 1943. Zhang Yan looked at the various changes in the present world. He secretly calculated his opportunities and searched for people who could destroy the karma he had set up. However, even though he had chosen one person, because of the other parties will entrusted to him, the person who came into being was not simple. He might not be able to achieve his goal. Thus, he was prepared to choose another person if he failed the first time. However, such a figure had to be a hero amongst men, or possess great fortuitous encounters, or stand above their peers in order to compete with them. Because of karma, the world he saw was extremely similar to the world he came from, and if it was in terms of familiarity with the matters of this world, he would definitely not be able to compare to him. Spirit refinement almighty beings could see the past and the future in an instant. This wasn't a problem, but in order to reach Busu heaven, Ancestor Yao Han and the other two couldn't predict every future. They could only let the world run on its own. This was what it meant to leave behind a sliver of heaven's will. If the future was predetermined, then Busu heaven wouldn't appear. The reason why he didn't choose to use his previous body this time was because he had been dealing with Patriarch Yao Han. Patriarch Yao Han had focused all of his energy on dealing with him, and only a small portion of his energy had been used to open up the real world. It was already not easy for Patriarch Yao Han to maintain control of the real world, and he could only grasp a general direction. It was impossible for him to constantly pay attention to what was happening in the real world. But this time was different. With 3 people here, they could see everything that was happening in the real world. His previous self was connected by karma to him, so he couldn't be seen by his peers. Similarly, since they couldn't see him, then at the same time, his previous self naturally didn't exist. Of course, if this person didn't pay attention to him, his previous self would still appear. However, if it was just an existence like this, it would no longer be as useful as before. Although the 3 of them did not know the reason for founding Ancestor Yao Han's previous failure, they knew that as long as they kept an eye on him, he would be able to survive. That way, even if there were any loopholes, they could be plugged in time, so there was no chance here. The first person he could reach was Lu Gu. However, because of the owner of the demonic treasury, there was no way to reflect this item in this world. Even if he could imitate this technique, he was not a good candidate. Hence, he chose Feng Hai Yang. Ancestor Yao Han said, just now with the disturbance caused by the golden bead, Daoist Zhang has most likely sneaked in. If we can't find him, he will become an obstacle to the person we choose. He could be sure that Zhang Yan was also preparing to use someone connected by karma to stop them, but he didn't know who it was. Although that person would definitely jump out to deal with the person they had chosen, it would already be too late to make a move when he appeared. If they could kill him in advance, they would be able to eliminate this threat. Daoist Yu Qiu also sighed and said, I originally wanted to play the chess piece at the beginning of the world's creation, but after this move, it's difficult for me. Originally, he wanted to start making arrangements from just now, but doing so would involve more people, and the karma he would steal would be less, so he could only carefully maintain it. However, with the collision of the Tai golden bead, the past and the future were thrown into chaos, and his plan was completely disrupted. Many opportunities were lost inexplicably. In order to blur the truth and falsehood, they used the sapling this time, so they couldn't destroy this world and start over again. Now, they could only follow the development of the world and continuously kill those who stood in their way. Daoist Yu Qiu said in a low voice, no matter what that Daoist Zhang is planning, as long as we can expel his consciousness that has fallen into the world, even if our plan fails for a moment, we won't be able to stop the general trend. Daoist Yu Qiu said, but those 2 have also interfered. Daoist Yu Qiu nodded and said, I've already expected that. We just need to find a way to expel it and cut off its roots. Although the 2 of them had accepted the exchange of fragments, they had never actually agreed not to interfere with their affairs. They also never asked for anything, because they knew that it was useless. Fortunately, they had thought of this beforehand, so they used the fragments to split the heart of this generation. So now, they couldn't go all out like them. They thought that if they worked together, they would be able to expel it. But without this, whether it was Zhang Yan or those 2 of the same generation, all their remaining methods would naturally be useless. The 3 of them made up their minds and immediately channeled their techniques together, preparing to chase Zhang Yan and the 2 supreme dermic powers out. At first, they thought that it would not be difficult. However, what surprised them was that when they pressed forward, they actually stopped the 3 people in front of them with their mana. Among them, Zhang Yan used most of the power. This meant that his mana level had increased again after that battle. The other two were trying to comprehend the fragment, so although they couldn't pour their full strength into it, they were still able to provide some assistance. However, it was this indiscernible bit of assistance that was able to stop them. Patriarch Yahan made some calculations. In the end, they still had a high chance of winning. But the problem was that if the battle dragged on, there would be too many variables. The most troublesome thing was that as the two sides clashed, Zhang Yan would be able to gain more from them. Although it wouldn't be as deep as a direct clash, it would still be a hindrance to them. Patriarch Yahan said, "This kind of delay isn't reasonable. We need to resolve this as soon as possible." Daoist Jade Leek and Daoist Yu Qiu agreed. However, the clash of mana was the most fundamental manifestation of both sides' strength. There was no shortcut, so they couldn't find a good solution for now. Just as they were thinking of a solution, the three of them suddenly felt that something was wrong. They suddenly discovered that there was a strand of consciousness that shone in, but it only lasted for a moment. They didn't know if it had truly retreated or if it was just hiding here. What made the three of them feel that something was wrong was that they couldn't identify who this strand of consciousness came from. Daoist Jade Leek hurriedly tried to calculate, but he couldn't find anything. Patriarch Yahan frowned. This might be the remnant consciousness of a fellow Daoist from back then. It's normal that we can't identify it. The matters of the 9 continents back then involved too many things, so he didn't want to say too much. He even suspected that this might be the reason why the Tai golden bead could so easily disrupt the past and the future just now. Daoist Yu Qiu said, "You too, could it be that person?" Patriarch Yahan shook his head. "You worry too much. If it really is that person, we won't be able to detect it." Zhang Yan had also sensed this strange change, and deduced that the consciousness of another member of the same generation had entered. However, this was a projection created by founding ancestor Yao Han and the others, so if there were any external influences, it would be a matter of concern. Moreover, the more external influences there were, the heavier the burden on the members of the same generation would be, so he was happy to see this. His gaze moved back to the present world. In his eyes, this was still a sapling that was growing. When it finished evolving, the result would appear. Just now, when the Tai golden bead blasted into this place, it had shaken the foundation, but it was quickly stabilized by the other three. He couldn't help but ponder. If he could find a way from here, he could destroy the entire world. Even if it was difficult to do, it didn't stop him from putting on a threatening appearance and drawing in some of their attention. There was another use in doing this: he could force out the other party's hidden trump cards in advance. He was sure that the three of them most likely had some kind of treasure in their hands, but they had been hiding it all this time. If he could activate it in advance, he could disrupt the other party's plan. Thinking of this, he summoned the Tai golden bead again, but it seemed to be on the verge of falling. Patriarch Yahan and the others immediately felt threatened. Just now, they had seen the power of the bead, and they couldn't ignore it. Patriarch Yahan said, "At this point, we can only use our treasures." Daoist Yu Qiu nodded. "Then I'll leave it to you, fellow Daoist." The two of them did indeed have Dharma treasures hidden on them, but they were not meant to be used against Zhang Yan. Instead, they were meant to be used against others. It should be known that the three of them had enemies other than the two whom they had temporarily stabilized with the good fortune fragment. There were also threats from other places. Especially the aura that had suddenly appeared and vanished just now, it even caused them to have a trace of doubt in their hearts. If they took out all of their treasures now and were seen by the other party, it would be equivalent to losing one of their hidden trump cards. Moreover, these treasures were only for protection. The two sides were fighting in the present world, not face to face. So even if they brought out all of their treasures, it wouldn't affect the battle much. Patriarch Yahan shook his sleeve, and a golden lotus flew out. It floated in the air, ready to block the Tai golden bead if it fell again. As expected, the moment this treasure appeared, the pressure on the three lessened, and their magic power began to circulate. Seeing this, Zhang Yan could guess what was going on. Because the two sides were in a stalemate, no one could overwhelm the other. So he turned his gaze back to the present world. In the Netherworld Spring sect, after Feng Haiyang saw the future in the fixed middle view, he knew that he would be killed by Zhou Ji in the future. Many things appeared in his mind. Some were fragments of the future, and some were cultivation methods. However, these things weren't beyond his understanding, so he was still suspicious of the future. There were many methods in the spirit gate that could change one's mind, so he couldn't be sure who was plotting against him. The only thing that could prove this was the future that hadn't happened yet. At the same time, he tried to find out the secrets of the Yuxiao school through various channels, but there was no news about Zhou Ji. It was as if he had never existed. However, even if it was an extremely ordinary disciple of the Zhou clan from the Jade Sky sect, the spies of the Netherspring sect would still be able to find him. But now, he had disappeared without a trace. Either this person really didn't exist in the world, or he was hidden. In the following days, he didn't act rashly, and his actions were as usual. It wasn't until 2 years later that he personally went to the fixed middle view to investigate the things he saw and found that the results didn't match the memories in his mind. Only then did he believe it. In those fragments of the future, he could faintly see that the Yuxiao school had a shocking plan, and the key to it was the Yuxiao disciple named Zhou Ji. Because the sword competition of the 16 sects was in a year, he believed that since this person was so important, he would definitely appear at the sword competition assembly. At that time, he would see this person, and as long as he killed him, he would be able to stop this plan. After understanding this, he continued to focus on cultivation. Chapter 1944. Zhang Yan looked at the actions of the people with karma in the modern world, but he did not interfere. This battle would not be decided in 1 or 2 times. If Feng Haiyang could not stop the other, then there were others to choose from. Similarly, Zhou Ji had the protection of ancestor Yao Han and the others. Even if he failed, as long as he did not die, he could make a comeback. If this person was successfully killed, and if this person was not willing to give up, there was still a possibility of summoning another person. However, if this was done, there was still a possibility of finding Bushutian, but it was very unlikely. So as long as this person was killed, it was almost the same as winning the battle. The changes in the world were gradually approaching the eve of the sword battle between the 16 sections. Everyone was deliberately avoiding the future, so no one knew what would happen. However, this was also the reason why the heavenly secrets were still alive. From the perspective of karma, this was an extremely important step for placing a chess piece. As long as one could get past it, the rest would be smooth sailing. However, if one failed, there would be even more obstacles. As such, the Yao Han Patriarch and the other 2 were paying close attention to this matter. At this moment, in the modern world, as the sword battle between the 16 sects approached, Feng Haiyang finally heard about Zhou Ji's whereabouts. Because Zhou Ji would appear in the sword battle assembly, there was no need to hide at this time. However, whether it was his peers in the Xian Gate or the Spirit Gate, they did not know much about him. It seemed that he had suddenly appeared. After Feng Haiyang had gone through a lot of things and made a lot of arrangements, he made a decision. He was going to find Zhou Ji and kill him before Dozhan. This was because he believed that when the 16 sects fought, Zhou Ji would be more prepared and would be more difficult to deal with. It was different now. If he could kill Zhou Ji, not only would he have one less opponent in the sword battle, but he would also be able to resolve the karma in the future. Although Zhou Ji did not exist in the main world behind Zhang Yan, Feng Haiyang had already killed Ban Xiaoming of the Shaoqing sect before the sword duel, eliminating a powerful opponent for the Nether Spring sect. His actions this time might have different objectives, but they were surprisingly similar. Because Zhou Ji was entrusted with the will of the Yao Han ancestor, he could be said to be born with knowledge. But no matter how good he was, even if his talent and comprehension far surpassed his peers, he was not inhuman because of the restrictions of the heavens. His battle experience could not be gained without sparring. Therefore, after the Yuxiao school decided on the candidates, they started to visit their peers. Firstly, it was to accumulate reputation. Secondly, it was to try to understand his disciples' methods, so as to know himself and his enemy. This gave Feng Haiyang a chance. He took the initiative to issue a challenge when Zhou Ji was visiting. Killing him halfway would not work. He was not a Shaoqing disciple and had always been a loner. He was not afraid of fighting with others. Putting aside the fact that he had the protection of his sect's elders, even if he was alone, a fight between peers would not be decided in a short period of time. It would be enough for reinforcements to arrive. Only by openly issuing a challenge like this would they be able to make him unable to avoid it. If they were to shrink back, then the reputation that they had accumulated during this period of time would surely be ruined. No matter what, the Jade Sky sect wouldn't send a disciple that was afraid to avoid battle to battle. As expected, Feng Haiyang's plan forced Zhou Ji to stop and accept the challenge. However, because neither of them was willing to expose their methods before the sword duel, they decided to fight in an uninhabited wasteland. However, because both of them had the protection of their sect's elders, it was almost impossible to end the other party's life. Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Is this person chosen by Taoist Zhang?" Ancestor Yao Han pondered for a while and said, "It's hard to say." The Nether Spring sect was founded by Ancestor Ling Yu, but he was rather mysterious. Aside from Jiu Zhou's clone that day, he'd never seen Ling Yu, and it was even to the extent that he didn't see Ling Yu when the fortune essence shattered. Therefore, when it involved the people or things of the sect he founded, it was difficult to determine whether it was related to him or not. Moreover, through the karma that he intercepted, he knew that the 9 regions were in a period of time where the Tao was declining and the devil was growing. This was the will of the heavens, so it was not too unexpected that 1 or 2 outstanding talents would occasionally appear in the spiritual gate. Taoist Yu Lu said, "It doesn't matter whether it is or not. Just watch." Even if they knew, they could not interfere. They could only rely on Zhou Ji to solve this matter. If he was still killed by the other party, it could only mean that they were temporarily not fated to meet Zhou Ji. In order to deal with Zhou Ji, Feng Haiyang had secretly prepared a few killing moves. However, during the battle, he found that he could not find a good opportunity to use them. Not only was the opponent as powerful as the rumors said, but the person watching from behind never let down his guard. Even if he forced himself to use them, he would only expose his own methods. It was the same for Zhou Ji. However, he was not like Feng Haiyang. Although he wanted to take advantage of the situation to kill his opponent, he gave up the idea when he found that there was no opportunity to fight. The battle lasted for 5 days, but in the end, it ended in a draw. Neither side achieved their goal. Because the next crucial moment had not arrived, Ancestor Yao Han and the others focused their attention on the stalemate again. Taoist Yu Qiu said, "At this moment, Taoist Zhang can still stand against me because of the help of those 2. If we can make them retreat, he will not be able to do anything alone." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "I'm afraid those 2 are unwilling." Taoist Yu Qiu smiled and said, "We can try." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Fellow Taoist, do you have a way to persuade them?" Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Fellow Taoists, do you still remember the place we divined in Dingzhong?" Taoist Yu Qiu said, "This matter is hard to confirm, and if it is not good, it might be disadvantageous to me." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Whether it is advantageous or disadvantageous depends on whether I can use it. There is no harm in telling them about this. If there is any obstruction, they will bear it with me. If there is no obstruction, perhaps we can move them." He looked at the 2 and said, "Even if they do not retreat, we will not suffer any losses." Ancestor Yao Han and Taoist Yu Qiu discussed for a while and agreed. Taoist Yu Qiu immediately sent his consciousness incarnation to the 2's Dao Palace. He bowed and said, "Fellow Taoists, are you here?" Zhang Yan's incarnation was also here. He smiled and stood up from the praying mat. He said, "Since the 2 of you have matters to attend to, I will take my leave first." With that, he stepped out and disappeared. The 2 Taoists did not invite Taoist Yu Qiu to enter. The one on the left said, "If fellow Taoist has something to say, please speak frankly." Taoist Yu Qiu smiled and said, "The 2 of you should understand why I am here. I wonder if the 2 of you can withdraw from this dispute." The 2 Taoists were expressionless. Taoist Yu Qiu said with a seemingly sincere expression, to be honest, the reason we opened up this world is to obtain an item from that fellow Taoist Zhang. If we can obtain it, we are willing to study it together with the two of you. The two Taoists did not believe this at all. The two clans were originally enemies, and now they were clearly here to divide them. The more it was like this, the more they wanted to stay here. Disadvantageous to the enemy was advantageous to them. Unless the other party took out something that moved them and they were sure they could obtain it, then they would retreat. Taoist Yu Qiu saw that the two of them were unmoved, so he said a few cryptic words in a low voice. Then, he smiled and bowed before leaving. After he left, the Taoist on the left said, "Is that true?" The Taoist on the right pondered for a moment and said, "He only wants me to move aside. If there was such a good thing, he would have gone there himself long ago. Why is there a need to tell us?" The Taoist on the left said, "Fellow Taoists' words are in line with my thoughts. There's definitely something strange about this. We can just ignore it." Then, he pointed outside and said, "Who does fellow Taoist think will win this round?" The Taoist on the right said, "That Taoist Zhang is able to fight until now and still not lose. It's already very extraordinary. If the two of us are here to help him, he will surely have a chance at victory. But this time, it will be difficult for him to go against everyone." The Taoist on the left said, "Fellow Taoist, do you think this person can be a fellow Taoist of mine?" The Taoist on the right pondered for a moment and said, "It wouldn't be good if Yu Lu and the others took advantage of it." He paused for a moment and said, "There's no harm in discussing it after this battle. If this fellow Taoist Zhang is willing to share great benefits with me, then I won't be stingy in helping him." The two of them agreed that Zhang Yan was alone in the end. Even if he could hold out for now, he wouldn't be able to gain the upper hand in the long run and would most likely lose this battle. However, the outcome of a battle between spirit refinement cultivators depended on the outcome of the battle. If one couldn't completely overwhelm the other party, as long as there was an opportunity, the other party could still make a comeback. Thus, they felt that it was better to take this opportunity to try and pull Zhang Yan over to their side. The most important reason for this was that Ancestor Yao Han and the other two Taoists had gone through so much trouble. They were also interested in the item in Zhang Yan's hand and wanted to see what was going on. On the other side, Zhang Yan also felt that although the two sides were evenly matched, it wasn't appropriate for the long run. As long as one side's strength increased slightly, they would be able to suppress the other side. Ancestor Yao Han had 3 people on his side. Whether it was methods or opportunities, they were far superior to Zhang Yan's side. Thus, Zhang Yan needed a method to counter them at a crucial moment. At this moment, although he was able to observe some changes through the battle, it was very limited that he could directly use it in battle. Moreover, the other side was very cautious, and their defense was abnormally firm, not giving him any chance to attack. Fortunately, there was a breakthrough point here. When he fought with Ancestor Yao Han previously, Ancestor Yao Han's magic power was clearly weaker, but Ancestor Yao Han's advantage was negated. This was because Ancestor Yao Han had found a way to increase his magic power. Now, the two sides were evenly matched. It wasn't that Ancestor Yao Han didn't change, but because Ancestor Yao Han had learned his lesson and didn't let Ancestor Yao Han take the initiative. Right now, the magic power of both sides could be said to be the same, but as long as one side had a slight advantage, it could tip the scales of victory. Moreover, Ancestor Yao Han still had a trump card that he hadn't used yet. He thought to himself, if necessary, I might as well try it. Even if I can't win, I can still suppress him. Chapter 1945. After the battle with Ancestor Yao Han, Zhang Yan had experimented with this and found that he wouldn't be disturbed by any external mana. In other words, when his opponent made a change, he could calculate the next step or even more changes and then use them outside. This way, his mana wouldn't just increase by 1 level and he would be able to gain the upper hand in an instant. On the surface, it seemed that as long as he continued to calculate in the broken jade, his mana would increase infinitely, but that wasn't the case. Because in a real fight, even if you had the ability to calculate endless changes, you couldn't just jump to the highest point. Your mana needed to be like stepping on a ladder, increasing step by step. This was not only because of the confrontation of mana between deity refinement cultivators, there was another important reason, and that was the transformation of mana ultimately depended on one's own cultivation. Only when one's cultivation reached a certain level would one's mana be able to increase to a certain level. There was a limit to it. With the help of the broken jade, he didn't need to waste time calculating in a fight with his peers. This way, every time he improved, he would be one step faster than his opponent. After a few rounds, he would accumulate a lot of advantages. However, Ancestor Yao Han and the other two had higher cultivation than him, so once he made a move, he had to defeat his opponent before their mana reached a higher level. If he went soft and was delayed until the end, it would be hard to say who would win. This could be considered one of his killing moves. However, he was not prepared to use it at this moment because he felt that he might encounter dangerous situations in the future. It would be best to use it at that time. Right now, he had not reached the most dangerous moment. If he could stop the person who was born from fulfilling his wish by placing a piece in the real world, there was no need for him to expose it. In the real world, his avatar returned to the nameless Tao Palace. After greeting the two Taoists, he sat down on the praying mat. The Taoist on the left said, "Tao friend, aren't you going to ask why the other party is here just now?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "I'm just here to persuade you two to withdraw from this fight. If you two agreed, you wouldn't be here, so there's no need to ask." The Taoist couldn't help but nod. He changed the topic and said, "Fellow Taoist, I see that you're fighting this person alone. Even if you're not at a disadvantage for a while, you won't be able to hold on for long. I wonder if fellow Taoist is interested in making an agreement with me." The Taoist on the right also looked over. Zhang Yan thought to himself. These two were clearly using the situation to pressure him, forcing him to form an alliance with them. In the beginning, the two of them didn't seem to have such intentions. They probably thought he was worth roping in after seeing him fight against Ancestor Yao Han and the other two. On the surface, considering the pros and cons, this was actually a good choice. But after interacting with the two of them, he could feel that their alliance was secondary. Their main target was Bushutian, who was behind him. However, the more he learned about Bushutian, the more he felt that this thing was not simple. It was not a good thing to expose it. Moreover, he sensed that forming an alliance with the other one was not the best choice. If he continued to wait, there would be more mysteries, so he said, "I appreciate your good intentions, but I have no intention of forming an alliance at the moment." When the two Taoists heard him decline, they weren't unhappy. This time, they were merely testing him. It didn't matter if he didn't agree. Regarding this battle, they judged that Zhang Yan was the weaker party. When he was in danger, he would be the one begging them. When that time comes, they would be able to make more requests. In the modern world, the river of time flowed, and soon, it was time for the 16 sects to compete. The elites of the sects first fought outside of Chengyuan Gorge before entering the Star Stone realm. Zhang Yan noticed that because this was the world illuminator, many situations were different from what he had experienced before even though he was not present. This meant that the karma involved with the Yao Han patriarch was not as deep as he had initially thought. He believed that this wasn't just because his magic power was fighting against this person. It was likely that Patriarch Yao Han was intentionally avoiding something. There was no need to think too much to know why. Back then, the four great sects of the 9 continents, Azure Sea, Shaoqing, Jade Firmament, and Nether Spring, all had their own origins. Not to mention whether or not they could be completely revealed, even if they could, it would most likely involve the people behind them. It wasn't that Patriarch Yao Han was afraid of the others, but the more powerful figures involved, the more variables there would be. At this time, his gaze moved slightly. Inside the Star Stone, after a bitter fight between the Xianling and Feng Haiyang, Zhou Ji, and Feng Haiyang met again. In this battle, the two did not have the protection of their sect's elders. In addition, the disciples of the 16 sects had all retreated, so there was no one else in the Star Stone. Both sides no longer had any misgivings, and they repeatedly used their divine abilities and killing moves. The two could be said to be evenly matched. After more than 10 days, Feng Haiyang had the upper hand. Zhou Ji saw that he was no match, but he retreated with the help of the decree and did not suffer any injuries. When the ancestor Yao Han and the other two saw this, they frowned. They did not expect that Zhou Ji would lose in the end. It was not because of his divine abilities, but because he lacked battle experience. But this difference was enough to determine the outcome of the battle. When Zhang Yan saw this, he nodded slightly. Although Feng Haiyang did not kill Zhou Ji, he had taken Jun Yang's spiritual qi and ruined one of Jun Yang's opportunities. Because he had personally participated in the Star Stone battle, he knew more about it than the ancestor Yao Han and the other two. On the surface, it seemed that Zhou Ji's battle ability was weaker than his opponent. But in reality, that was not the case. Because Feng Haiyang foresaw that he would be defeated, he came with the determination to die. Before this slash, he had abandoned all his Dharma treasures and treasures that could be used to retreat. He was even prepared to die with the enemy. During the battle, Zhou Ji could tell that Feng Haiyang would rather die than retreat. He believed that he still had a bright future ahead of him and that there was no need for him to fight to the death with his opponent here. Hence, he retreated at the last moment. It was not that he was inferior to his opponent, but that he did not have the determination to die. Zhang Yan knew that Zhou Ji had only missed Jun Yang's spiritual qi. But on the path of cultivation, especially in the early stages, one step ahead meant one step at a time. Now that he had fallen behind, he could only try to find more elsewhere in the future. But there were only so many of the best external items for cultivation. His opponent was already better than him, and he had taken away his opportunities first. It would not be easy to catch up again. Moreover, if he retreated now, would he retreat again the next time he encountered the same situation? He had lost in terms of willpower. Just now, he had truly lost. When he thought of this, he raised his guard. Since his opponent had lost here, he would definitely find a way to get it back from somewhere else. The next confrontation would be even more intense. On the other side, Taoist Yu Qiu sighed and said, "Fellow Taoists, the person who fulfilled the vow has lost this battle. Will he continue?" Patriarch Yao Han said in a low voice, "Although he lost, his life was saved. That means he still has a chance. What does a momentary victory or defeat matter?" Taoist Yu Lu also said, "It's just a loss. As long as the person who entrusted the vow survives, we still have a chance. There's no need to be so calculative." Taoist Yao Han said, "It's good to win the battle in the present world, but there's no need to be calculative even if we lose. If I can suppress that Taoist Zhang, the outcome of this battle will be decided by me." Taoist Yu Lu said in a low voice, "Those two Taoists have not made a move yet. I think they are unwilling to retreat." Patriarch Yao Han said, "In the end, we can't rely on outsiders. We still need to use our own methods." Taoist Yu Qiu looked at him and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you mean?" Patriarch Yao Han said, "That's exactly what I mean." Taoist Yu Qiu frowned and said, "Isn't it too much to use this method on that Taoist Zhang?" They did have a backup plan and had yet to make a move. The battle between spirit refinement cultivators was not just a battle of arcane energy. There was also a change in one's cultivation. After all, with an immeasurable amount of arcane energy, any change could be made. Thus, they came up with a killer move, which was to extract a strand of arcane energy from their bodies. Because one strand of arcane energy was immeasurable, as long as one focused on it and waited for it to come out, it would accumulate to an astonishing scale. If this was used in a battle against someone of the same generation, it would become the key to victory. However, to maintain such a large amount of arcane energy, one's own consumption would be even greater. Thus, these three powers would wear each other down, and they would also need an artifact to maintain it so that it wouldn't collapse. It could be said that they had spent a great deal of effort on this. They had originally planned to use it against the two in front of them, but whether it was Taoist Yu Qiu or Taoist Yu Lu, they felt that it was not the right time to use it here. Patriarch Yao Han said, "If we can defeat that Taoist Zhang and obtain Bushutian, wouldn't it be better than this loss?" Daoist Yu Qiu said, "Fellow Daoist, you should know that the two of them also have a backup plan. If we use it here, it will be difficult to deal with them in the future." Patriarch Yahan shook his sleeves and said, "Compared to Bushutian, these can all give way." Daoist Yulu also said, "The situation is not at the point of no return yet." Patriarch Yahan said, "When that time comes, it will be too late." Seeing how insistent he was, Daoist Yu Qiu and Daoist Yulu carefully thought about it and found that even if they exposed their methods, they would still be in a disadvantageous position, but they would not be suppressed by the other two, so they agreed. Once the three of them agreed, they didn't delay any longer. They immediately combined their spiritual power, and in an instant, a shiny treasure appeared from the silence. If a spirit refinement cultivator sensed danger, they would be able to sense it in advance. Once this was done, the two Taoists in the nameless Tao Palace immediately felt that something was wrong. The Taoist on the left did some calculations and was shocked, so they had this hidden card. He knew that if this killer move was used in battle, even if he knew beforehand, he would not be able to deal with it. He couldn't help but sigh, "I didn't think that Taoist Zhang would be able to force this killer move out. I wonder if he can block it." The Taoist on the right shook his head and said plainly, "Even if the two of us were to encounter this, we would not be able to deal with it. That Taoist Zhang's defeat is certain." Chapter 1946. At this moment, Zhang Yan also felt a premonition of danger. He immediately guessed that the other side must have seen their defeat in the modern world and wanted to turn the situation around. They must be about to use some kind of powerful killing move. This couldn't be treated the same as before. If he didn't handle it well, he might lose. He made some calculations in his mind. The only thing he could do now was to act before the other side. As long as he could suppress the other side in one fell swoop, he wouldn't be able to use this move. He didn't hide anymore. He stood in the broken jade and calculated the changes in his magic power. Then, he turned to the modern world. In an instant, the changes in his magic power increased by several layers, giving him a great advantage. Like a fierce tide breaking through a dam, the originally thick wall in front of him was broken, and then it poured out behind him. If Patriarch Yahan wanted to use it, he needed to undo the restraints of the treasure. The three of them had to work together to control it in order to release the boundless Weili. That was why there was a moment of delay. It was like accumulating power before using it. Because the power was too strong, even if the opponent noticed it, they wouldn't be able to block it. Thus, this flaw could be completely ignored. However, the three of them didn't expect that this flaw would allow Zhang Yan to be one step ahead of them. In an instant, they felt an unprecedented tyrannical pressure pressing down on them. Not only did the layers of magic power they had constructed collapse, even the modern world couldn't help but shake. Daoist Yu Qiu's expression changed, and he said, "Not good, quickly stop." At this time, they still did not have the time to unleash the power that they had accumulated, and it was the time to spit it out. If they could not control it, then they might not be able to release it towards their opponents, and it might even injure themselves. However, it was easy to take it out, but difficult to take it back. Now that there was Zhang Yan's Fa suppressing it, the sapling that appeared in the world was also shaking non-stop, as if it could break at any time. When Taoist Jade Leek saw this, he immediately flicked his sleeve and a jade white treasured ladle flew out. It instantly suppressed the treasure that was glowing brightly, and then he said, "Leave this place to me. The two of you first block the magic power attack of Taoist Zhang." Taoist Yu Qiu made a hand seal as well. Behind him, white smoke was like smoke, and within the haziness, there seemed to be a living creature appearing. One of its eyes was opened, and with just a glance downwards, it stabilized the world that was about to collapse. The sapling also stopped swaying. Patriarch Yahan did his best to use the Pauline in his hand to block the surging magic power. However, facing the monstrous power, he couldn't bear it and was forced to retreat. Zhang Yan didn't show any mercy. The Tai golden bead casually moved, and it crashed into the modern world, bombarding the three's defenses repeatedly. Originally, the two sides were evenly divided, but now it was clear that Zhang Yan had the upper hand. The three's power was suppressed to the limit. If it weren't for the treasure barely holding on, the modern world would have been able to hold on, and they would have lost the battle. In the nameless Dao Palace, two people were watching intently. They had been waiting for Zhang Yan to lose his chance to save him, but it wasn't just to save him. They were plotting against Bushutian, who was behind him. They didn't know what it was, but for Patriarch Yao Han and the other two to mobilize so many people and even reveal their killer move, the fragment's value was definitely higher than they thought. But who would have thought that the situation would be turned around in an instant? It looked like the Yao Han Patriarch and the other two were on the verge of collapse. Even though they were barely holding on, if outsiders were to help them, their defeat would be a foregone conclusion. The two thought about it carefully. If they were in the same position as Patriarch Yao Han and the other two, they wouldn't have it any better either. The Daoist on the left was shocked. I didn't expect Daoist Zhang to have such a method. The Daoist on the right was silent for a long time before he slowly said, I don't know what method he used, but we didn't notice anything before. The Daoist on the left frowned. In a battle between spirit refinement cultivators, before the other side used any powerful methods, they would usually be able to sense it in advance, and the one with higher cultivation could easily calculate the strength of the one with lower cultivation. But this time, not only did they not sense anything, they wanted to look at it for a long time, but they were unable to divine anything. It was as if there was nothing there. Thus, the two of them thought that either the method here was beyond their comprehension, or Zhang Yan had an even more brilliant concealment method. In reality, this was because before Zhang Yan made his move, all his plans were within the jade fragment, which was why there were no signs of it. The Daoist on the left side and said, Fellow Daoist, we can only express our goodwill this time. The Daoist on the right also nodded. If such a figure insisted on making things difficult for them, then it would definitely not be good news. Fortunately, they had always been friendly with him, and not only did they not form enmity with him, they even helped him, so it could be said that they were fated. Daoist Yu Qiu's sapling stopped growing, and he couldn't help but sigh. This was because their magic power was suppressed by Zhang Yan, so they didn't have any energy left to move the modern world. Although the modern world river would still evolve on its own, without their willpower, it would be difficult to find Bushutian, and everything they did would be meaningless. He said, one wrong move, and the whole game is lost. There is no meaning in continuing, we should retreat. Daoist Yu Qiu said, it seems that we are not fated with Bushutian. He looked at Patriarch Yao Han and asked, what does fellow Daoist think? Patriarch Yao Han replied, it is only a momentary failure. Fellow Daoist Yu Qiu, we have failed this time, but if there is a chance in the future, we can still use this method. He clearly didn't want to die completely and was waiting for a good opportunity to evolve again. Daoist Yu Qiu naturally understood his meaning and said, don't worry, fellow Daoist, I know what to do. He took out a seal, and the sapling shook. In an instant, the modern world collapsed, and the treasure returned to its unborn state. With a shake, it flew into his sleeve and disappeared. After the three of them came to a decision, they slowly withdrew their fa li, revealing that they were no longer going to resist. Then, they retreated far away. When Zhang Yan saw this, he knew that Qin Shi had already admitted defeat and had no intention to continue fighting with him. He thought about it for a moment, and it was obviously impossible for him to force Qin Shi into eternal silence in one go. So he didn't continue pursuing Qin Shi and withdrew. However, this didn't mean that he was going to let this matter go. In the future, when his cultivation reached a certain level, he would look for them to talk about the past. As he was thinking, he suddenly sensed something and turned around to see a Daoist standing there with a smile on his face. When the Daoist saw him, he bowed to him from afar. His heart moved, and he returned the greeting. What brings you here, fellow Daoist? The Daoist smiled and said, you can call me Zhan Yuan. I am not on the same side as the three Daoists. Zhang Yan understood. Just now, when the three were creating the modern world, he sensed a Wei Li entering the modern world. It should be this person in front of him. He said, fellow Daoist, what is your purpose for coming here? Taoist Zhang Yuan said calmly, naturally, I have something to ask of you, so I wanted to give you some face. I originally wanted to help you when you couldn't resist, but I didn't expect you to end the matter yourself. Just now, Zhang Yan had sensed a trace of mystery. He suspected that it fell on this person, so he said, what is it that you want? Taoist Zhang Yuan said with a smile, I have to ask you something first. In the future, will you seek your Tao from yourself or from others? During the battle with Ancestor Yao Han and the others, Zhang Yan could vaguely grasp some things, but there were still some things that he couldn't understand because of the limitations of his cultivation. Hearing this person's words, he said, what's the difference between seeking from myself and seeking from others? Taoist Zhang Yuan said, if you seek from yourself, it means you are sincere in your cultivation and understanding the mystery. If you seek from others, it means you seek good fortune to complete your body. Just now, Yu Lu, Yu Qiu, and even Yao Han are all seeking outside help. Speaking up to this point, he paused and said, this generation searched everywhere for good fortune fragments and used them to cultivate the crossing technique. I once tried to find this method and found that the world's truth lies within it. This path is indeed feasible, but since the essence of good fortune was broken, I have never seen anyone walk through it. Perhaps only by gathering all the fragments together will there be hope, but this is extremely difficult. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. The essence of good fortune should be the perfect item. Although he had seen the scene of that day, he didn't know whether it was because someone had walked through this path or because someone had tried to walk through it. Taoist Zhang Yuan said, I see that your treasure has an extraordinary origin. Is it related to the essence of good fortune? Zhang Yan didn't hide this and said, yes. This treasure was originally born from the fragment of the essence of good fortune. Taoist Zhang Yuan nodded and said, like Yu Lu, the treasures in his hands were collected from the fragment of the essence of good fortune and used his own magic power to observe it. There are very few treasures like the one in your hand that were born naturally. Zhang Yan was quite interested in this, so he continued to ask. Only then did he learn that most of the treasures in the hands of spirit refinement realm experts were related to the essence of good fortune. They were either refined directly from its fragments or obtained its essence and were born naturally. The former could be refined continuously after collecting the fragments, and the magic treasure's power would become stronger and stronger. The latter could only be improved by the owner's observation. In comparison, both sides could be said to have their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, if one was willing to put in the fragments of a refined treasure, it could be improved to a very tyrannical level. However, these treasures were usually used for enlightenment, and no powerful expert would be willing to use all of them to refine them. On the other hand, there was no need to pursue these things with innate birth treasures. However, the disadvantage was that if the owner's own cultivation was insufficient, the treasure would not be very strong. When Zhang Yan thought of this, he somewhat understood what Taoist Zhang Yuan meant by asking for help outside oneself. He looked over and said, listening to your words, I assume that you are the person who asked for help. Taoist Zhang Yuan nodded and said, yes. He looked up and stared at Zhang Yan. It's just that this method is very difficult. Do you really want to hear it? Zhang Yan smiled and said, I would like to ask for guidance. Chapter 1947. Taoist Zhang Yuan looked at Zhang Yan for a moment before withdrawing his gaze. After a moment of silence, he slowly opened his mouth and said, the way to seek oneself is to destroy oneself and live toward death. Zhang Yan's mind shook slightly when he heard this, and he felt as if he'd opened some sort of door. For a time, countless comprehensions surged out from his heart, but there was still a faint barrier that came into contact with the true Tao, but he was unable to break through in the end. Taoist Zhang Yuan quickly revealed the truth. The so-called destruction of oneself is to destroy the stubbornness. The so-called stubbornness is the mark of existence in the world, the mark of the Great Way. You, me, and all things in the world are the same. The marks of living beings in the world are unconscious of life and death. They exist together with heaven and earth. If we cannot transcend, it is just like the river of the world under our feet. We can wave our hands and summon them. The reincarnation, life, and death are all controlled by our hearts. When we open our eyes, thousands of things will happen. Zhang Yan nodded slowly. If there is existence, there is Tao. If there is Tao, there is permanence. If there is permanence, there is change. If there is change, there is life. In the world, the rise and fall of heaven and earth, and even life and death, become the future and the past. Isn't this the stubbornness of heaven and earth? At this moment, Taoist Zhang Yuan continued, the marks of all things in the world are permanent, neither growing nor disappearing. The stubbornness of our spirit refinement is immortal, and external disasters are difficult to erase. It has its own spirituality. If you succeed, it will succeed. If you change, it will also change. However, after transcending the world, it will be difficult to merge again. Zhang Yan immediately understood what he meant. His stubbornness was originally the mark of his existence in the world, but after he jumped into the world, the mark of his existence in the world disappeared. However, because the mighty figure of spirit refinement still existed, the mark did not actually disappear. Instead, it continued to exist in another way. However, the change of the two sides was equivalent to missing each other, which would eventually bring obstacles to each other. It was like two parallel lines, one and the same, divided into yin and yang. Originally, you were me, and I was you. Although they did not intersect, they were still in the same place. However, after he refined his spirit, yin and yang were separated. Only these slight deviations caused both sides to deviate. One day, they would meet. At that time, a violent collision would occur. He pondered for a moment and said, when I was observing the Tao, I didn't notice such a change. Does fellow Taoist have anything to say about it? Taoist Zhang Yuan said, you don't feel it now because your cultivation hasn't reached that stage yet. However, as your cultivation improves, you will have to face it sooner or later. But if you don't admire the Great Way, then you won't have to worry about it. Zhang Yan instantly understood. This was just like how a spirit refinement almighty cultivator would be far away from the real world after breaking through. However, one was far away while the other was near. As his cultivation level increased, he would get closer and closer to the real world. In the end, he would see it. Unless he stopped pursuing the Grand Tao and stopped improving his cultivation, then he would naturally not encounter such danger. Thinking of this, he asked again, according to what you said, if we don't pass this test, our cultivation will be obstructed. Then how do those who seek help from the outside pass? Taoist Zhang Yuan said, if you seek help from the outside, you can only observe the essence of creation and use the Great Way to understand yourself. Then, you can bypass the obstacle of understanding the real world and resolve the stubbornness step by step. When the Dharma and Logos are clear, this disaster will be eliminated. But if you fail to suppress it, the stubbornness will suddenly change, and everything will disappear. Zhang Yan couldn't help but ponder. According to Taoist Zhang Yuan, those who seek help from the outside actually didn't eliminate the stubbornness. Instead, they chose to bypass it for the time being and pursue the Great Way. After comprehending it, they would go back and resolve the stubbornness bit by bit. However, this method wasn't very safe. It was equivalent to crossing a dangerous mountain and a cliff. One wrong step and they would fall. Those who seek help from the outside actually wanted to cut off this obstacle in one go. Then, there would be no such obstacle in the future cultivation, and the future path would be smooth. From his point of view, he was willing to solve the problem at the very beginning. If the stubbornness wasn't subdued as soon as possible, it would leave a flaw in your cultivation. Even if you could subdue it yourself, your opponent might take advantage of it. He asked, if I want to walk the path of seeking help from the outside, do you have any advice? Taoist Zhang Yuan revealed a smile and said, you should know that once you walk this path, there is no turning back. Zhang Yan smiled and said, my words are in the hands of my friend, but it is up to me to take the path. Taoist Zhang Yuan paused for a moment and then said, because the stubbornness is you, it can obtain all the magical powers and Tao techniques that you know. It also understands what you are thinking in your heart. When the day comes that the path is completed, it will be born from your spirit and come to find you. It will be extremely difficult to kill it, so you should be careful. As soon as Zhang Yan heard this, he knew that the stubbornness was actually him. The only difference was that he had a magic weapon in his hand, while the stubbornness didn't. In other words, the stubbornness was only him and didn't have any external objects. But there was still a problem here, because the two were originally one. If he could use the treasure, then the stubbornness could also use it. Unless he couldn't use the treasure as he wished. But because the stubbornness was born from the spirit, if the magic weapon couldn't be hidden in the spirit, then it probably wouldn't be reflected in the spirit. Therefore, this advantage might not be useful. He thought for a moment and asked, what will happen if I don't pass the obstacle of understanding the truth? Taoist Zhang Yuan was silent for a moment and then said in a deep voice, if you don't pass the obstacle, you will still be you, but you will also not be you. His words were unclear, but Zhang Yan could understand it. Cultivating the spirit wouldn't die. At most, it would only lead to eternal silence. But if you failed to kill the stubbornness, you would be replaced by the stubbornness. In other words, the external side of you would die, but the real side of you would still exist. It didn't look like there was any difference, but there was actually a difference. It was just like how a living being in this world reincarnated. My past self is dead, and only my present self is still around. But to my past self, I am no longer me. What was even more frightening was that because the true self didn't change, those who knew you wouldn't be able to see that you had been replaced. Taoist Zhang Yuan said in a deep voice, this isn't the most dangerous thing. If the two sides are entangled, and there is no clear winner or loser, then we will never meet again. If the cultivating spirit didn't kill the stubbornness, nor was it replaced by the stubbornness, then it might disappear forever. Because the stubbornness and the self were originally one, there was no difference in magic power or cultivation. Usually, it was difficult to see who was superior. In addition, the magic power of the cultivating spirit was endless. This entanglement was likely to last forever, which was equivalent to eternal silence. In fact, this kind of situation was the easiest to see. Seeing that Zhang Yan was thinking, Taoist Zhang Yuan pondered for a moment and reminded him, if you want to seek your own Tao, then you need to be wary of those who seek outside. Don't leak the fact that you want to seek your own Tao. Hearing this, Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. Then, as if he had thought of something, his eyes flickered slightly. Taoist Zhang Yuan said, do you think that there is no conflict between those who seek inside and those who seek outside? Since I don't want to take the fragment of the essence of good fortune, you don't have to look for me. Zhang Yan looked at him and said, there must be some inside story. Taoist Zhang Yuan sighed and said, you should know that some of my peers have taken a different path from me, so it is inevitable that they will be biased. They think that in order to pursue their own Tao, they only need to focus on themselves and don't need to care about anything else. However, when living beings are born in this world, there are people, there are me, there are heaven and earth, and even if they jump into the long river of the world, there will still be people with the same Tao. If they only ask themselves, then everything else is not important. If they go one step further, then they will be enemies with everyone except me. Zhang Yan nodded. Just now, he had already thought of this. Why was it like what Taoist Zhang Yuan said? That was because some self-seeking people thought that they could pursue the Tao if they didn't get in their way. But how could they not get in their way? Outsiders wouldn't stop coming just because you didn't provoke them. Moreover, it was inevitable that the cultivating spirit would fight against each other. Therefore, the only thing they could do was to expel all those who could affect them into eternal silence. Then, everything would be quiet, and then they could pursue the Tao without any obstacles. Because this generation had a very clear goal and killed off their obsessions, their Taoist heart became pure, and their cultivation was likely to be more advanced than those who followed the same Tao. Moreover, they didn't think that what they were doing was wrong, and they would take it for granted that it was part of their path of cultivation. They wouldn't even let go of those who were pursuing the same Tao. Therefore, this generation was actually extremely dangerous. From the standpoint of those who sought outside, who knew if they would do the same thing if they sought the same Tao? It was better to eliminate the source as soon as possible. He couldn't help but ask, does such a person exist today? Taoist Zhang Yuan nodded slowly and confirmed the existence of such a person, but he didn't say what this person was called or where he was. He looked at Zhang Yan and said, after hearing all this, do you still want to pursue the Tao of self-seeking? Zhang Yan smiled indifferently and said, as a cultivator, I am only afraid that there is no way forward, so why would I be afraid of the dangerous Tao? Taoist Zhang Yuan was slightly shocked. He looked at him for a moment and said with emotion, what you said is correct. Zhang Yan looked at him and asked again, since you know about these Taoists and I, what is it that you want? Taoist Zhang Yuan said, it's not the right time yet for me to tell you what I want. I will tell you when the time is right. Then, he cupped his hands and said, it's a pleasure to meet you today. Let's say goodbye now. We'll talk again in the future. When he finished speaking, he waved his sleeves and his magic power slowly went away. Soon, it became faintly discernible and then disappeared. It was unknown whether it was because of a magic treasure or his own cultivation. Zhang Yan waited for this person to leave and began to think. From Zhang Yuan's words, it seemed that the powerful cultivators of the spirit refinement realm were divided into different camps, and the relationship between them was not harmonious. Taoist Zhang Yuan didn't say why he came this time because he was waiting for him to choose the Tao of self-seeking. But in his opinion, seeking outside and seeking the Tao of self-seeking was just a line drawn deliberately by people. When he sought the Tao of self-seeking, there was no harm in comprehending the essence of creation. The difference between the internal and external was just the manifestation of different principles. If he didn't take one, it would be like giving up a Tao for no reason. Now that there was a Tao, there was a reason for it. If he could understand everything, that would be the right path of the Tao.